The ceiling is made of wood. It's the first thing he sees, a wooden ceiling with a crack down the middle and a damp spot in the corner. Not stone. Not the ceiling under which he closed his eyes for the last time. That one was stone, streaked with brown and smelled of iron and urine. This one smells of pine resin and smoke. He's lying on his back and can't move. Not because of pain, because of confusion. His body feels light, too light. He raises his right hand and sees slender fingers without a single scar. No calluses from a sword hilt, no scorched skin on his knuckles. A child's fingers. No, the fingers of a young man who has never held anything heavier than a calligraphy brush. He runs his palm over his neck. Unscathed. Smooth. No scar from a rope, no dent from a blade. He remembers how the blade went in. He remembers the sound. A short, wet crunch. He remembers how the world turned upside down and he saw his own body from above for a split second before everything went black. But his neck is intact. He sat down. His body isn't responding well. His muscles are weak. His back aches like an old man's, though he feels that this body is no older than 17. Behind the wall, someone is ringing a bell, a steady, hollow sound, a monastery bell. He knows that rhythm, the morning call to prayer. A dog is barking somewhere. Through the window without shutters, he can see a grey sky and the snow-capped tops of pine trees. Mountains. He is in the north. He is in a monastery. He is in a body that does not belong to him. 20 years of war, 7 campaigns won, 200,000 soldiers under his command, 3 orders of heavenly valor, and 1 execution in the square of heavenly justice. All of this fit into a mind that now sat atop a gaunt, boyish neck in the monastery of the White Crane. He chuckled softly. The chuckle turned into a cough. His lungs were weak. The mountain air and dampness had taken their toll on this body long before he arrived. He coughed for a minute. Then he wiped his mouth with his sleeve and looked at the rag. It was clean. No blood. So all was not lost. Footsteps passed by the door, shuffling, slow. A monk. An old one, judging by the sound. His left leg was shorter than his right, or perhaps he had a bad knee. He determined this without thinking. He simply heard the sound and pieced it together. 20 years of habit, listening to footsteps and knowing who was coming. The footsteps faded away. He was left alone. Lee Mu-hyun, Marshal of the Northern Gate, a peasant's son who became a general, and a general who became a corpse. Now he sits inside the body of Ju Han, the emperor's illegitimate son, a bastard exiled to a monastery at the age of 6 so as not to upset Empress Myeong, a boy forgotten by everyone except the monk who brought him rice twice a day. He stood up. His legs were shaking. He took 3 steps toward the window and grabbed the windowsill to keep from falling. He looked down. The monastery courtyard. A stone path. 3 monks are walking toward the temple. Beyond the wall is a stable. Further still, a mountainside and a pine forest fading into the mist. Quiet. Peaceful. Not a single soldier in sight. He stood there, breathing. The air entered his diseased lungs like icy water. With every breath, a wheeze somewhere deep in his chest. This body hadn't run. It hadn't trained. It hadn't lifted anything heavier than a teapot. He did the math. 100 swings of the sword and his arms would give out. A quarter of an hour of running and he'd collapse. A night in the saddle would kill him. He knew the roadmap for the next 5 years. He knew every name, every date, every turn of events. Hwan Irion would lead the cavalry away. Minister So would delay the supply train. Eunuch Park would forge a report.
Tahan would strike from the west. 200,000 would die. 3 provinces would fall. The empire would begin to die. He knew all of this, but the body he inhabited could not climb the stairs without getting out of breath. He stepped away from the window, sat down on the floor, closed his eyes, began to breathe, slowly, deeply. Inhale for a count of 4. Hold for a count of 7. Exhale for a count of 8. An army breathing exercise taught to him by the regimental doctor 30 years ago, in that life that no longer exists. His lungs protested. He didn't stop. He did 20 cycles. On the 15th, he started coughing. By the 18th, the cough had subsided. By the 20th, he felt something deep in his chest relax just a little. Just a little. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. He opened his eyes. The room was small. A wooden plank bed, a thin blanket, a writing desk, a stack of books, a calligraphy brush and an inkstone. Ju-han loved calligraphy. This was something Lee Mu-hyun knew not from the memories of the body's previous owner. He had seen the hands, ink stains on the index and middle fingers.
A distinctive callus from the brush on the right hand. The boy wrote a lot and often. Well then, calligraphy is a good thing. In this empire, calligraphy opens doors that a sword cannot. He walked over to the table, sat down, picked up the brush. His hand remembered the grip on its own. Not his hand, Ju-han's hand. The muscle memory of its former owner. He dipped the brush in ink and wrote a single line on a blank sheet of paper. Even. Beautiful. Ju-han's handwriting was superb. In his past life, Lee Mu-hyung had written like a chicken scratching with its foot. The generals of the Northern Gate were not known for their elegance, but now he had the hands of a calligrapher and the mind of a military commander. He smiled. He wrote a second line, then a third. Then he set down the brush and fell into thought. The White Crane Monastery stands on the northern border. It's a 3-day journey to the nearest city, 2 months to the capital, a month and a half on horseback to the western border where, in 3 years, Tarhan will march his army. He is an exiled bastard. He has no rank, no money, no connections, no army, not even a healthy body. But he has 20 years of war in his head, a 5-year roadmap for the future, and something that not a single general in this empire possesses. He has already died once. He knows exactly what words about duty and honor are worth. Absolutely nothing. Words didn't stop the executioner. Words didn't stop the crowd from spitting on his corpse. Medals didn't save him from the noose. In his past life, he believed that the empire was the emperor and the throne. He served the emperor. He defended the throne. The emperor watched as they broke his legs and sipped tea. He no longer believes. And that is his greatest weapon. Because a man without illusions does not fall into the traps set for those who do. The door creaked. A monk entered, an old thin man. He carried a tray with a bowl of rice and a cup of water. The monk set the tray on the floor by the door. He looked at Ju-han, who was sitting at the table with a brush in his hand. He was surprised. Usually at this time the boy was still asleep. Ju-han looked at the monk. His left leg, his knee. He had guessed correctly. The monk had a noticeable dip in his left knee, an old injury, not an illness, a blow or a fall, about 30 years ago. The monk bowed and left. Ju-han ate the rice. The rice was cold and bland. In his past life, he'd eaten rice just like this in field camps. Back then, it was normal. Now, his weakened body craved something hot. He ate every last grain. He drank some water. He stood up. He walked over to the window again. The sun had risen higher. The fog was lifting. He could see the road leading down from the monastery to the pass. A man carrying a bundle of firewood was walking along the road. A peasant from the village at the foot of the mountain. An ordinary day. A peaceful day. In 3 years, this peace would end. In 3 years, the Tatkan cavalry will pass through the western mounting passes. The imperial army will meet them on the plain near Gyeongsu. Hwang Irion will withdraw the cavalry at the decisive moment, not out of cowardice, out of calculation. He will decide that if Lee Mu-hyun dies, he will become the empire's chief commander. And he will be right. Lee Mu-hyun will die. Hwang Irion will receive the title, and 200,000 soldiers will be left to rot on the battlefield. But that was last time. Now Lee Mu-hyun stands by the window in the monastery, breathing with the diseased lungs of a 17-year-old body. And he has a plan. Not a plan for revenge. Revenge isn't worth a second life. A plan for reform. The empire has rotted from within. The 8 great houses have divided power among themselves. Officials sell government posts. Border garrisons starve while the capital's regiments march in silk armor. Generals are appointed based on family ties rather than talent. You can't fix the system from within if you play by its rules. So first, you have to step outside the system. Go where no one is looking. To the outskirts. To the forgotten frontier. Build what's needed there. And then return. He turned away from the window. He paced the room. 4 steps in one direction, 4 in the other. A small cage, but a temporary one. The first thing he needs is a body. Without a body, he's useless. He won't be able to mount a horse. He won't be able to march. He won't be able to stand before the ranks. He has to get these lungs in shape, build muscle, at least to a basic level. Not to a marshal's level, that's impossible in a year. But at least to the level of a healthy young man who can spend a day on his feet. He sat down on the floor again. He started with something simple. Squats. 10. On the 7th, his legs began to tremble. On the 9th, he nearly fell. On the 10th, he braced himself against the wall with his hand.
Pathetic. What a pathetic body.
He exhaled. Did 10 more. Fell to his knees. Lay down on the floor.
Stared at the wooden ceiling. That very ceiling with the crack. 20 squats. Marshal of the Northern Gates. Commander of a 200,000-strong army. He collapsed after 20 squats. He would have laughed, but his lungs wouldn't let him. Instead, he closed his eyes and began to make a plan. A plan for the month. Breathing exercises in the morning and evening. Squats. Push-ups once his arms get stronger. Stretching. Running around the monastery courtyard before dawn when no one is watching. In a month, he should be able to do 100 squats without stopping. In 3 months, run around the monastery wall 10 times. In half a year, sit confidently in the saddle. That's the minimum. Next comes the next task, to escape from the monastery. The White Crane Monastery isn't a prison, at least not technically. Ju-han isn't a prisoner. He's an exiled prince under the abbot's care. But to leave the monastery, he needs an order from the capital, or a pretext. He'll come up with a pretext. To do that, he needs to make himself noticeable. Not too noticeable, just enough so that some minor official sees in him not a shadow, but an opportunity. He spent the rest of the day poring over books. Ju-han's books were good. Confucian classics, historical chronicles, a treatise on water supply for mountain fortresses. This treatise piqued his interest. He read it twice. The author was knowledgeable but didn't understand the practical side of things. Too much theory, not enough calculations.
Lee Mu-hyung knew about water supply from experience. He had set up camps in the mountains. He knew what slope a gutter needed. He knew how much water a garrison of 300 men required. He knew where to drill a well based on the color of the grass on the slope. He took a blank sheet of paper. He began to write. The calligrapher's hand produced even lines. The commander's mind dictated the content. He was writing a treatise on water supply for mountain garrisons, not as a scholar, but as a man who had done this with his own hands, with specific numbers, with descriptions of tools, with notes on the most common mistakes and how to avoid them. He wrote for 3 hours. The light outside the window began to fade. He lit a candle. He continued. His hand grew tired. His fingers went numb, but the text flowed smoothly and didn't stop. By nightfall, he had written 4 pages. It was a third of the treatise. Tomorrow, he would finish it. The day after tomorrow, he would type up a clean copy.
The treatise would be his ticket in, not from the monastery, but from invisibility.
He blew out the candle. He lay down on the hard bed. He covered himself with a thin blanket. His body ached from 20 squats. His lungs wheezed. A dog barked behind the wall. He closed his eyes. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, he knew exactly what he had to do. Not intuition, not hope, a clear plan. And 5 years before the world would collapse. He fell asleep quickly. In his dream, he saw the square of heavenly justice. He saw the spitting crowd. He saw the blade. But this time, he wasn't lying on the platform. He was standing above the square, looking down, and the square was empty. Morning came with the ringing of a bell. He opened his eyes. A wooden ceiling. A crack in the same spot. A damp spot. Not a dream. The second day of his second life. He got up. His body ached, but he stood up. He walked over to the window. Snow. Pine trees. Silence. He began to breathe. Inhale for a count of 4. 7 count hold. 8 count exhale. 20 cycles. Then 30 squats. On the 25th, he fell. He got up. Did 5 more. Then he ate the rice the monk had brought. Then he sat down to work on his treatise. The day passed in work, and the 3rd day passed the same way, and the 4th. On the 5th day, he came down from his room into the courtyard, for the first time in a long time. The monks looked at him in surprise. Chu Han had hardly ever left his cell for the past 2 years, and here he was, standing in the courtyard, pale, skinny, but standing up straight. His back was straight. He wasn't slouching like usual, and his eyes were different. A monk named Wonmo, who had been bringing him rice, stopped and looked closely. Something had changed in this boy. He couldn't figure out what, but he felt uneasy. It's like when you look at a cat and suddenly realize it isn't a cat. Chu Han walked across the courtyard toward the stable. He walked slowly. His breathing was steady. He controlled every step. To an outsider, it looked as if the young man had simply gone out for some fresh air. In reality, he was counting his steps, measuring the courtyard, estimating distances. A habit. A marshal enters any place, and the first thing he does is locate the exits. A man was standing by the stable, an elderly man, sturdy, with hands that had no superfluous features. Every movement was precise, economical. That's how people who have carried weapons for a long time move. A stable hand.
His name was Park Dong-soo. Ju Han knew that name. Park Dong-soo did everything as instructed.
He cut away the horny layer. Beneath it was an abscess. The pus was dark and had a sour smell. The nail had been driven in crookedly and had burrowed deep into the horny sheath. The county veterinarian had examined the leg but hadn't bothered to check the hoof. The stable hand washed the wound with vinegar and garlic. He applied hot tar. He bandaged it. The mare flinched but didn't kick out. She was old, patient, used to pain. Ju-han stood nearby and watched. Not the horse. Park Dong-soo's hands. Strong hands, precise, not a single unnecessary movement. That's how people who are used to repairing equipment in the field work. Not doctors. Soldiers. A corporal in the 3rd Regiment of the 2nd Division. Lee Moo-hyun remembered. The 3rd Regiment was stationed at the Hamyeon Pass in the winter. Back then, Lieutenant Lee had commanded a company in a neighboring regiment. The 3rd Regiment had lost half its men to the cold and skirmishes with Alto raiders. Those who survived were discharged and forgotten. Park Dong-soo was one of those forgotten men. The groom finished bandaging the wound. He straightened up, wiped his hands with a rag. He looked at Ju-han. "Your Highness, why have you come?" Ju-han did not answer right away. He was looking at the mare. She stood calmly, keeping her bandaged leg off the ground. In 10 days, she would be walking again. He knew this for certain because he had seen dozens of such cases in field camps. Horses didn't die from wounds. They died from poor shoeing and lazy farriers. He turned to Park Dong-soo. He said he wanted to come to the stable every day. He said he wanted to learn to ride. Park Dong-soo raised an eyebrow. A prince who hadn't left his cell for 10 years suddenly wanted to ride a horse. Strange, but he nodded. "Come in the morning, before the bell rings." Ju-han nodded in response and left. He climbed the stone steps to his cell. He stopped halfway up the stairs. His breath was ragged. His lungs were burning. He stood there for a minute. He caught his breath, then he continued on. 22 steps. He memorized the number. Tomorrow he would walk them without stopping. In a week he would run them. In his cell he sat down at the table and continued working on his treatise. His hand had already gotten used to it. The lines were smoother. Ju-han's handwriting was truly beautiful. Every character was perfectly formed.
In his past life, Lee Moo-hyun had dictated his orders to a scribe because he was ashamed of his own handwriting.
A peasant's son. He had learnt to read and write at 16 when he was drafted into the army. He wrote poorly right up until the very end. Now he had handwriting that would pass any scrutiny in the capital. He worked until evening. He finished the 5th sheet. The treatise was almost ready. Precise. Concrete, with calculations that any competent engineer could apply immediately. Not philosophy. Practice. That was precisely what set him apart in his past life. Marshal Lee Moo-hyun didn't theorize about strategy. He built camps, dug wells, counted sacks of grain, knew how much water a person needed per day, how much rice for a 3-day march, how many arrows an archer would use in an hour-long battle. Little things. Trivialities that add up to victory. The generals of the 8 great houses didn't know these trivialities. They knew how to sit gracefully on a horse, how to deliver a speech before the ranks, how to write a report to the emperor. But they had no idea how much a horseshoe cost or when to replace it. Morning. The 6th day. He got up before the bell rang. He went down to the stables in the dark. Park Dong-soo was already there. He was saddling a sturdy horse, a short, calm gelding, for beginners. The stable hand looked at Ju-han. He said briefly, "Get on." Ju-han approached the gelding. He put his foot in the stirrup. His body remembered how to do it. Not Ju Han's body, Li Mu-hyung's body. Muscle memory from a past life overlaid his new muscles, and the result was strange. He knew every movement, but his body couldn't execute them. He pulled himself up on the third try. He sat in the saddle crookedly. He adjusted his position. The mare stood calmly. Ju Han straightened his back. He took the reins. Park Dong-soo watched. His eyebrows slowly crept upward. A boy who had never ridden a horse before held the reins like a cavalryman, not like a beginner, like someone who knows what to do but is too weak to do it. The difference was enormous. A beginner doesn't know where to put his hands. This young man knew exactly where to put his hands. It was just that his hands were trembling. Ju Han rode 3 laps around the courtyard. On the 4th, he nearly fell. He grabbed the mane. He held on. He dismounted. His legs were shaking. His thighs were burning. Park Dong-soo approached.
He said quietly, "Your Highness, have you ridden a horse before?" It wasn't a question. Ju Han looked at the old stable hand. The former foreman's eyes were calm and attentive, the eyes of a man who had seen enough in life not to be surprised by the strange. Ju Han replied briefly, "No, never." Park Dong-soo was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right. Again tomorrow." They didn't speak of it further. But Ju Han saw how the old stable hand's gaze had changed. Not suspicion, not fear. Something else. Attention. The keen, alert attention of a soldier who had sensed something familiar in an unfamiliar place. The days passed. He rode every morning. He did breathing exercises in the mornings and evenings. He did squats. He did push-ups. His body was changing slowly, but it was changing. On the 10th day, he climbed the stairs without stopping. On the 12th, he ran around the courtyard 3 times. On the 15th day, he stood at attention with an imaginary sword for 10 minutes without his legs trembling. The mare recovered on the 9th day. On the 10th day, she came out of the stable and walked a circle around the courtyard. She wasn't limping. The abbot came to take a look. He patted the horse. He asked Park Dong-soo who had made the diagnosis. The stable hand didn't answer right away. He said he'd figured it out on his own. The abbot nodded and left. Ju Han stood off to the side and heard the conversation. Park Dong-soo didn't mention his name, not out of secrecy, out of instinct. An old soldier doesn't betray his commander, even if the commander is 17 years old and weighs as much as a wet cat. On the 11th day after the mare's recovery, Park Dong-soo approached Ju Han after the morning riding training. He stood before him. He paused. Then he dropped to one knee. Ju Han froze. The old stable hand knelt in the morning dust, head bowed, hands on his hip, the posture of a vassal. The posture taught in the army on the very first day. One knee, right hand on the hip, head down. That's how one stands before a commander. Not before a prince. Before a commander. Park Dong-soo spoke without raising his head. He said he had served in the Northern Gate Border Guard 20 years ago. He had served under Marshal Lee Mu-hyun when the marshal was still a young lieutenant. He said that Marshal Lee had treated a horse in his presence once in his life, in exactly the same way. By the hoof, by the smell, by the sound of the horse's hoof striking the ground. He had never seen anyone else examine horses that way. He said he didn't know who was standing before him. He said it didn't matter to him. He said 3 words. "I'm yours. Until death." Ju Han stood there in silence. Something he hadn't expected welled up inside him. Not the joy of gaining his first ally.
Not the satisfaction that the plan was working. Something else. Something hot and heavy. This man was kneeling before him. Not before a prince. Before a marshal who had been executed and spat upon. Before a corpse left to rot at the gates. This old stable hand remembered. Someone remembered. He swallowed hard. He told him to stand up. Park Dong-soo stood up. He looked him in the eyes. Ju-han held his gaze. Then he said quietly, "I need a man I can trust. Not a servant, not a guard. A man." Park Dong-soo nodded. Ju-han nodded back. That was it. No oaths, no solemn words. The two soldiers understood each other. One was 17 and looked like a pale boy with ink-stained fingers. The other was over 50 and looked like a weary stable hand with a sore knee. But as they stood facing each other in the morning dust of the monastery courtyard, between them was something that had nothing to do with age or appearance. Memory. A shared memory of the war, which had ended differently for each of them, yet equally badly. From that day on, Park Dong-soo became his shadow. Not intrusively, not noticeable to others. The old stable hand simply always happened to be nearby when needed. He brought hot water for breathing exercises. He found herbs for a cough remedy. He groomed the gelding before morning training so that Ju-han wouldn't have to waste time. Little things. A soldier's care for his commander. Ju-han saw this and understood its value. In his past life, he had thousands of soldiers, entire armies, staffs, aides-de-camp. Now he had just one 50-year-old stable hand with a bad knee. And this one man was worth more than the entire Northern Gate headquarters. Because his headquarters had betrayed him. But this man would not betray him. By the end of the 3rd week, he had finished the treatise. 12 sheets in neat calligraphic handwriting. A treatise on water supply for mountain garrisons. A practical guide with calculations and drawings. He reread it 3 times, corrected 2 errors in the calculations, made sure that nothing in the text directly revealed his military experience. Everything was presented as the result of reading and reflection.
A talented young man had studied the subject through books and proposed solutions. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that couldn't be explained. He hid the treatise in a stack of books. It wasn't time for it yet. The treatise will be needed when the official from the Ministry of Ceremonies arrives. The annual inspection of the bastards. One of the lower-ranking officials comes once a year to check that the exiled princes are alive and haven't escaped. A formality. 10 minutes of inspection. A signature in the logbook. But for Ju-han, these 10 minutes will become a window. His only window to the outside world. He began to prepare. First, calligraphy. He practiced for 2 hours every day. Not the treatise. 2 months passed faster than he'd expected. His body was changing. It hadn't become strong, but it had become fit for work. His lungs still wheezed on cold mornings, but they no longer burned after climbing the stairs. He could run around the monastery wall 8 times without stopping. He could stay in the saddle for an hour without his knees trembling. He could do 100 squats and stand up afterward without support. Far from a marshal's physical condition, but for a 17-year-old scribe from a mountain monastery, he was a different person. The monks noticed the changes. Abbot Wonjin, an old, taciturn man with a face like a prune, approached his cell twice and stood at the door. He didn't come in. He listened. He heard the floor creak from the squats, the rustle of paper, the smell of ink. He left. He said nothing. The abbot was a wise man. He had looked after the forgotten prince for 20 years and had grown accustomed to the boy being as quiet as a mouse. Now the mouse was turning into something else.
The abbot didn't know exactly what, but he sensed that he shouldn't interfere. There were things that were difficult for him. Food. The monastery kitchen served the same meals every day. Rice, vegetables, sometimes fish. The body needed meat, protein for growing muscles. He asked Park Dong-soo. Once a week, the stable hand began going down to the village at the foot of the mountain and bringing back dried meat, venison and jerky. They hid it in the stable behind the bales of hay. The monks were vegetarians by conviction and would not have approved. A small secret, the first of many. There were things that came easily. Calligraphy. He now wrote with ease. Ju-han's hands remembered the brush as an extension of himself.
Lee Moo-hyun merely guided the content. The result was extraordinary. The beauty of form and the precision of content. It was as if a poet had suddenly begun writing military regulations in perfect verse. There were things he could not get used to. Silence. In his past life, he had always been surrounded by people. Headquarters, aides-de-camp, messengers, the clatter of hooves, the clang of weapons, voices, hundreds of voices every day. Now, silence. Mountains. The wind. The bell twice a day. And silence. Sometimes at night he would lie awake, listening to the wind howling through the cracks in the walls. And he would remember. The square. The crowd. The blade. These memories wouldn't go away. He didn't try to chase them away. They were a part of him, his fuel. Every time his body wanted to stop, when his lungs were burning and his legs were giving out, he would remember how they'd broken his legs on the platform. And he'd get back up. Morning, the 3rd month, the day the official was due to arrive. Ju-han woke up before dawn. He got dressed. He checked the treaties. 12 sheets. Blank. Smooth. Not a single stain. The petition. 1 sheet. Flawless. He placed them on the table, sat down, and waited. The official arrived around noon. His name was Kang Pyong-soo, a low-ranking inspector of the 6th rank. Young, about 30 years old, with a weary face and a robe damp with sweat. The road from the county to the mountains had been arduous. He was accompanied by 2 clerks and 4 guards. Standard procedure. The annual inspection of exiled members of the imperial family, a formality that took a single day and was recorded with a single line in the logbook. Abbot Won-jin met the official at the gate. He escorted him to the guest room and offered him tea. Kang Pyong-soo drank his tea and reviewed the papers. Prince Ju-han, the emperor's illegitimate son by a laundress, exiled at the age of 6. Healthy, quiet, poses no threat. The same thing every year. He finished his tea and asked for the prince to be brought in. Ju-han entered the guest room. Kang Pyong-soo looked up and froze for a second. The boy had changed. He had seen him a year ago. Back then, a stooped, pale young man with empty eyes and sunken cheeks had stood before him. Now, the same young man stood before him, yet he was different. His back was straight. His gaze was steady. Not defiant, not provocative. Calm. His face was still pale, but not sickly. His cheekbones were more defined. His shoulders were slightly broader. Minor details. But the official was accustomed to noticing such details. It was part of his job. Ju-han bowed exactly to the depth prescribed by etiquette for his rank. Not a hair's breadth deeper, not a hair higher. Kang Pyong-soo took note of this. A year ago, the boy had bowed too low, as if frightened. Now it was exactly by the book. They sat down. The official asked the usual questions: health, behavior, studies. Ju-han answered matter-of-factly.
His health had worsened. His lungs couldn't handle the mountain air. His cough had gotten worse in the winter. He practices calligraphy and reading. He studies the classics. Kang Pyong-soo took notes, standard answers. Then Ju-han took out the petition. He placed it on the table. Kang Pyong-soo picked it up. He read it. He raised an eyebrow. The petition was flawlessly composed, not just grammatically correct, flawless. Every character was correct. Every turn of phrase was in the right place. The wording was precise, respectful but not obsequious. Such a petition could have been written by a graduate of the Academy of Celestial Knowledge, not an exiled bastard in a mountain monastery. The official looked at the young man more closely. Ju-han held his gaze. Then he took out the treatise. 12 sheets. He placed it next to the petition. He said that while studying the classics, he had noticed a problem with the water supply to mountain fortifications. He had jotted down some notes. Perhaps they would be useful. Kang Pyong-soo picked up the first sheet. He began to read. A minute later, his tea had gone cold. 5 minutes later, he had forgotten that he had come to inspect an exiled bastard. The treatise was unusual. No theoretical musings, just concrete calculations. The volume of water required for a garrison of 300 men, the slope of the gutter, the depth of the well depending on the type of soil, common mistakes made when laying water pipes, methods of purification. Everything was presented clearly and specifically. Kang Byung-soo was not an engineer, but he was smart enough to distinguish empty drivel from real work. This was real work. He finished reading the treatise. He set it down on the table. He looked at Ju-han. "Your Highness, how do you know this?" It was the same question Park Dong-soo had asked. Ju-han gave the same answer. "From books." Kang Pyong-soo didn't believe him. Neither did Park Dong-soo. But unlike the stable hand, the official didn't dwell on it further. He had a more important thought.
"I can show this treatise to my superior. He'll show it to his superior. A well-written document is a rarity at the Ministry of Rights. Most petitions are complaints about the weather or requests for money. A treatise on water supply with calculations is a godsend." Kang Pyong-soo hid the treatise in his travel chest. He took the petition. He bowed to Ju-han with a respect he had never shown him during his previous visits. He left. Ju-han stood at the monastery gate and watched as the small caravan descended the mountain road. Park Dong-soo stood nearby. He said nothing. Shu Ju-han said without turning around, "In 3 months a reply will come. An assignment to the western border, Hamju Fortress. The position of food inspector." Park Dong-soo looked at him. He didn't ask how he knew. He just nodded. 3 months. "All right, I'll be ready." They stood at the gate. The wind drove the clouds across the pine trees. Far below on the road, the figure of the official grew smaller and smaller. Ju-han turned and walked back to the monastery. 3 months of waiting. He would make the most of every one of them. Every day, every hour. His body had to grow stronger. His mind had to grow sharper. He began reading everything in the monastery library. Not the classics, chronicles, reports, old dispatches from border garrisons that someone had once brought here and forgotten. Yellowed scrolls bearing the names of commanders long gone. Descriptions of fortresses that had long been empty. Numbers that had long since ceased to reflect reality. But the structure remained. He saw how the Empire's border system had functioned 100 years ago, back when it still worked. He saw what had broken down, where it had begun to rot. Central supply collapsed first. Previously, every border district received grain and weapons from the capital on a strict schedule. Then the deliveries began to be delayed. Then some of the shipments began to go missing along the way.
Then the districts began to feed themselves. Then those that couldn't feed themselves began to die. Hamju was one such place, a district on the western border. 4 fortresses, or 3. One burned down 15 years ago and was never rebuilt. 3 fortresses, a nominal garrison of 2,000 men. The actual number is unknown. According to reports from 5 years ago, about 600. Now there may be fewer. The garrison commander, Khan Teju, an old officer. He's ill.
Reports from the last 2 years increasingly mention his daughter, Han Soru. No position, no rank. Just a name next to her father's in every report. Someone is running the garrison while the commander lies in bed. And that someone is his daughter.
Ju-han read and memorized every name, every number, every detail. He knew Hamju from his past life, but in that past life he had arrived there already as a marshal, with an army, with authority. Now he would arrive there as a nobody, a boy inspector sent to fill out paperwork. He had to know the place before he saw it. The 3rd month was drawing to a close. Ju-han was sitting in the library reading when Park Dong-soo entered at a brisk pace. This was unusual. The stable hand was never in a hurry. His face was tense. He said one word. "Guests." Ju-han stood up. He went out onto the 2nd-floor gallery from where he could see the courtyard. 2 men stood at the gate. Not monks, not officials. 2 men in traveling clothes with swords at their belts. One was tall with long arms. The other was shorter, with a round face and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Ju-han looked at them. Park Dong-soo stood behind him. "Your Highness, these not travelers." Ju-han nodded. He could see that. The tall one stood relaxed, but kept his weight on his front leg, ready to move in any direction, a fighter's habit. The round-faced one was smiling at the abbot and saying something about a pilgrimage. A lie. Pilgrims don't carry battle swords. Pilgrims don't look around the perimeter of the courtyard as they entered the gate. The morning after the assassins left was quiet. Fine, dry snow was falling. Ju-han stood by the window and looked at the tracks leading from the monastery gate down the mountain road. 2 people. Heavy ones. They were moving quickly. They weren't running, but they were in a hurry. He turned away from the window. He sat down at the table. His hands didn't tremble. The sleepless night hadn't affected his mind. It was a habit. In his past life, he'd go without sleep for 3 days during campaigns and make decisions on which the lives of thousands depended. One sleepless night in the monastery was nothing. But his body felt otherwise. By noon, fatigue set in. Heavy, overwhelming. He lay down and slept for 4 hours. He woke up coughing, a long, wet cough that wouldn't stop. He coughed for a minute, then another minute. His mouth tasted like copper. He spat. He looked. There was no blood, just phlegm. His lungs were weak. The stress had taken its toll on them. He lay on his back and thought. The assassins were gone. But the problem remained. Someone in the capital knows that the bastard has changed. They'll find out quickly. That means the informant is close by, among the monks, in the village at the foot of the mountain. Or perhaps Kan Pyong-soo himself told someone on the way back. It didn't matter. Something else was important. The next ones wouldn't come with swords. The next ones would come with poison or an order. Or they'd simply stop sending rice. He needed to leave. Soon. Sooner than he'd expected. He stood up, got dressed. He went down to the stable. Park Dong-soo was grooming the gelding. His face was ashen from lack of sleep. The cutlass lay nearby on a bench. Ju-han looked at the cutlass, then at the stable hand. "We need an escape plan." Park Dong-soo nodded. They talked for an hour. quietly, by the stable wall where no one could hear them. Ju-han laid out the situation like an officer at a military council, briefly, precisely, without unnecessary words. The monastery was no longer safe. A response to the petition would arrive in 2 months, if it arrived at all. In 2 months, they might send new people. We need an alternate route. Park Dong-soo listened. Then he said he knew a trail through the northern pass, an old hunting trail. It leads to the river, down the river to the county seat, 3 days by boat. You can blend into the crowd in the town. But in winter, the pass is dangerous. Snow, ice, wind. For a frail body, it's a deadly journey. Ju-han nodded. He took note of it. He neither rejected nor approved it. He simply filed it away in his mind as an option. For the next 2 weeks, he lived a double life. During the day, his usual routine, training, reading, calligraphy. The abbot saw a diligent young man. The monks saw a quiet boy. In the evenings, preparation. He packed his things. Not much. 2 spare robes, an inkstone and brushes, money, a little. Ju-han had been saving the small coins the abbot gave him for personal expenses. Over the course of 11 years, he had saved enough to live modestly for a month in a county town. He tied the coins in a rag and hid them under a floorboard. The treatise, a copy. He had copied the entire treatise a second time. The original had left with Kang Pyong-soo. The copy would remain with him. Who knows what might happen to the original? Notes. He began keeping notes that no one was supposed to see.
Not on paper, in his head. Lists, names, dates. A roadmap of the future laid out month by month. In 2 years and 4 months, Tarkan would begin gathering his troops at the Western Pass. In 2 years and 8 months, the first scouts will cross the border. In 3 years, the main forces will advance. In his past life, he found out about this too late, when the Tarkan cavalry was already on the plain. Now he knows in advance. But this knowledge is useless if he remains in the monastery. He needs to be at the western border 2 years before the attack. He needs time to rebuild the garrisons, train the men, and prepare the defenses. 2 years. That's not a short time. But it's not that long either, considering he's starting from scratch. The petition. He was waiting for a reply. Every day he would step out onto the gallery and look down the road. He wasn't waiting for a courier. He was waiting for a sign. Dust on the road. A rider. An official on a mule. Anything but silence. Silence meant that the petition was sitting on someone's desk and no one was reading it, or that it had been read and thrown away, or that it had been read and they were deciding what to do with the bastard who had suddenly become too clever. In the 6th week of waiting, a man arrived. Not a courier, not an official. A monk. A young one, from the Pure Lotus Monastery in the capital. He brought a letter to Abbot Wonjin. Ju-han learned of this from Park Dong-soo. The stable hand had a habit of being wherever information flowed. He didn't eavesdrop. He just happened to be nearby, cleaning the tack against the wall behind which people were talking, watering a horse as a messenger passed by. An old soldier's habit. Information is more important than a sword. The letter was from an official in the capital, not from Kang Pyong-soo, from someone higher up. Park Dong-soo didn't know the contents, but he saw the abbot's face after he read it. Pensive. Not alarmed, pensive. That evening, the abbot summoned Ju-han to his quarters. The abbot's room was small and smelled of incense. Wonjin sat at a low table. 2 scrolls lay before him. One bore the seal of the Ministry of Rites. The other bore the seal of the Office of Internal Affairs. The abbot looked at Ju-han for a long time. Then he spoke. He said he had received an order. Prince Ju-han was to be transferred from the White Crane Monastery to the border district of Ha. The position was that of food inspector. The term was indefinite. He was to depart within a month. Ju-han listened.
His face was calm. Inside, everything tightened and relaxed. It worked. He nodded. He thanked the abbot. The abbot did not let him go right away. He looked at him again, with that long gaze that people around him had begun to direct at him more and more often. Then he said, "Your Highness, I have watched over you for 11 years. You were a quiet boy, a good boy. I don't know what has changed, but be careful. The world outside these walls is not kind to those who change too quickly." Ju-han looked at the old monk. Won-jin was not his friend. He was not an ally. He was a jailer in soft clothing, but an honest jailer, and those words were honest. Ju-han bowed more deeply than protocol required, for the first time since he'd been at the monastery. Not as a prince to a monk, as a junior to a senior. He stepped out, stood in the hallway, breathed. Hamju, the western border. A forgotten fortress on the edge of the empire. A place no one wants to go. A place where the unwanted are exiled. A place where, in 2.5 years, Tarhan will strike. He smiled. Not a marshal's smile. An ordinary one. A human one. The first step had been taken. A month to prepare. He spent it with a surgeon's precision. The first week, his body. He doubled his training. He ran along a mountain trail every morning. His body protested. His lungs burned. His muscles ached. He didn't stop. The journey to Hamju would take 1.5 months on horseback. He had to hold out. Second week, equipment. Pak Dong-soo went down to the village and bought everything he needed. A warm traveling cloak, boots, dried meat for the journey, a bag of medicinal herbs. The stable hand knew the mountains. He knew what was needed on the road. He knew which herbs to brew for frostbite, which ones for an upset stomach, which ones for a cough. Third week, information. Ju-han had finished reading all the scrolls in the monastery library that had even the slightest connection to the western border. Not much, but enough to fill in the map in his head. He knew Hamju from his past life, but that was the Hamju whom the marshal had seen with his. Now he would see the Hamju that the forgotten inspector saw. The difference would be enormous. The fourth week. Farewell. Not a grand one, a quiet one. He said goodbye to the monk Wonmo, who had brought him rice for 11 years. He bowed to him. The old monk said nothing. He simply nodded. He said goodbye to the librarian who had looked after the scrolls for 20 years.
He gave him his best brush as a gift. The librarian accepted the gift and looked at the young man as if seeing him for the first time. The abbot came out to see them off to the gate. It was a cold morning. The snow had stopped a week ago, but the mountains were still white. 2 men stood at the gate of the White Crane Monastery. Ju-han wore a traveling cloak with 2 trunks of books tied to a pack horse. Pak Dong-soo wore an old soldier's jacket altered into traveling attire. 2 men and 2 horses. A bastard prince and a former corporal, against the empire. Ju-han mounted his horse. His body was used to it. His back was straight. His hands were steady. They didn't tremble. 3 months of training had paid off. He looked at the monastery. Wooden walls, a roof covered in snow, a bell tower. The cell where he had spent 11 years as Ju-han and 3 months as Lee Mu-hyun. He turned his horse around and set off down the road, without looking back. Pak Dong-soo followed. The road down the mountain was narrow, ice on the rocks. The horses walked cautiously. Ju-han sat steady in the saddle. He breathed, controlling every breath. The cold air cut into his lungs. He paid no attention. Ahead lay a journey of 1.5 months across half the empire. From the northern mountains to the west, across the plains, through county towns, through villages and markets and checkpoints.
A world he hadn't seen in 11 years through Ju Han's eyes, nor in 3 years through Li Muhyon's, because 3 years ago Li Muhyon had been executed. They descended to a village at the foot of the mountain around noon. It was a small village, 20 houses, a market consisting of 3 shops, a blacksmith shop, a fabric shop, a tavern. Ju Han stopped at the tavern. He dismounted. His legs were aching. An hour in the saddle and he was already tired. His body was weak. He was still far from being back to normal. They sat down in the tavern. They ordered hot soup and rice. The owner looked at Ju Han. He recognized him as the boy from the monastery, that pale, quiet boy they sometimes saw on the mounting trail. He served the soup. It was an ordinary soup, beans, turnips, and a little pork. Ju Han ate slowly. The taste of this simple meal after 3 months of monastery rice seemed like a luxury. In his past life, he had eaten such soup at every field camp and hadn't noticed it. Now he did. Park Dong-soo ate in silence. He kept an eye on the door, on the windows.
The journey across the empire took 42 days. 42 days on horseback, along roads that grew worse with each passing day as they traveled west. The first 2 weeks were bearable. Plains, county towns, inns serving hot meals, stone-paved roads. The imperial postal system still functioned here. Stages with horses were stationed every 30 li. The bridges were intact. Officials on the roads checked travel permits and bowed upon seeing the seal of the Ministry of Rights. The empire seemed alive. Ju Han looked on and saw something else. He saw merchants in the markets selling grain at double the price with no one keeping watch. He saw soldiers at the outposts wearing boots full of holes and spears with rusty tips. He saw peasants in the fields slouching and not raising their heads when a horseman rode past. Not out of respect, out of the habit that nothing good could be expected from horsemen. Trifles. But the picture is made up of trifles. The empire was rotting not from the top down, from the roots up. From every village where the tax collector takes his war share. From every outpost where an officer sells off a soldier's pay. From every bridge that's repaired a year after it collapses. Park Dong-soo saw the same thing. He didn't say anything. He just clenched his jaw a little tighter and stared at the road. He remembered this empire 20 years ago. Things were better back then. Not by much, but better. The roads were cleaner. The soldiers were better fed. The peasants weren't so bent over. 20 years. Not long by historical standards. Long enough for rust to eat right through. The 3rd week of the journey. The roads had gotten worse. The stone had run out. Then came trampled earth. Then mud. Then ruts in which the hooves got stuck. Inns became fewer and farther between. The food was worse. Instead of hot soup, there was cold porridge and stale water. Ju Han ate whatever they gave him, without complaint. His body was getting used to the journey. His lungs ached less. The dry air of the plains did him good. His legs grew stronger from daily horseback riding. His back stopped hurting by the end of the 2nd week. He began to look less like a sick boy and more like a thin young man. The difference was small, but noticeable. The 4th week. The western provinces. Here the empire did not end abruptly. It ended gradually. First, the postal stations disappeared. Then the officials on the roads. Then the outposts.
The road passed through empty villages and abandoned fields. Here and there stood the skeletal remains of burned-down houses, overgrown with weeds. Raids. Tarkhan raiders or local bandits. It made no difference to the peasants. On the 30th day of their journey, they passed through the town of Cheongju. Once a county seat with a garrison and a market. Now it was a half-empty town with closed shops and locked gates. Ju Han stopped at the market square. He dismounted. The square was empty. 3 merchants stood behind their stalls. One was selling salt, another rope, the third old clothes.
There were no customers. Juhan approached the salt merchant. He asked how much a sack cost. The merchant named his price. Juhan didn't bat an eye, but he took note of it inwardly. The price was 3 times higher than in the capital. Salt at the border is more valuable than gold, because the roads are in terrible condition and the caravans can't make it all the way, and because someone along the way takes half the cargo. He bought the salt. Pak Dong-su tied the sack to the pack horse. They moved on. On the 35th day of their journey, the landscape changed. The plain ended. The hills began. Dry, rocky. The grass was yellow and sparse. The wind was strong and constant, a westerly wind, a steppe wind. Beyond these hills lay the territory of Tarkan. Not immediately, though. After 100 li of no man's land, a buffer zone that the empire formally controlled but had long since given up on. On the 38th day they saw the first fortress, or rather what remained of it. The stone walls were half ruined. The gates were empty. The roof had collapsed. Inside there was nothing but debris and bird nests. Juhan dismounted. He went inside. He stood in the middle of the empty courtyard and looked around. Pak Dong-su stood beside him. This was Sanju, the northern outpost of Hamju County. 20 years ago, 300 soldiers were stationed here. Juhan knew this. He had read the reports in the monastery library. 300 soldiers, a blacksmith shop, stables for 50 horses, a granary, a well. Now it's empty. He walked across the courtyard. He examined the walls. Good stone, granite. The damage wasn't from a siege. It was from neglect. Rain, frost, time. It would take 3 months and 100 men to restore the walls. The foundation was intact. The well. He walked over. He looked down. It was dark. He dropped a stone in. A splash 4 heartbeats later. There was water, deep down, but there. He returned to the gate. He sat down on a rock. Pak Dong-su sat down beside him. They were silent. The wind whipped dust across the empty courtyard. Juhan said quietly, "In 2 years, soldiers will be standing here again." Pak Dong-su didn't answer. He just looked at the young man, then at the empty fortress, then back at the young man. And he nodded. They moved on. On the 42nd day, the walls of Hanju Fortress came into view. The fortress stood on a hill. Stone walls, towers at the corners, a gate with wooden doors, one of which hung crookedly on rusty hinges. The imperial banner on the tower had faded to a pale white. Juhan stopped his horse on the road 100 paces from the gate and looked on. In his previous life, he had seen Hamju once. He had ridden past with his army. Back then, there had still been something resembling a garrison here. Now he looked at the fortress through the eyes of an inspector and saw everything. The walls were intact, but hadn't been repaired in 5 years. The stone was crumbling in 3 places. The south tower had no roof. There were no sentries on the walls, not a single one. The gates were open. Several people were visible in the courtyard, not in uniform, in ordinary clothes. If they were soldiers, they had long since forgotten what a uniform was. Pak Dong-su exhaled quietly through clenched teeth. For a former soldier of the North Gate, this sight was an insult. Juhan urged his horse forward. They rode up to the gate. No one called out to them. No one came out to check on them. They rode into the courtyard. The courtyard was dirty. A cart with a broken wheel stood against the wall. Chickens wandered across the trampled earth. To the left was a barracks with a sagging roof. To the right was a building that had once served as headquarters. Between them was a well with a wooden cover. Juhan dismounted. He looked around. 3 people in the courtyard were staring at him, 2 men and a woman. The men were soldiers by their appearance, not their bearing. One was elderly with a hunched back. The other was young with a dull, indifferent expression. Neither was armed. Neither was in uniform. They wore dirty robes. The woman stood at the entrance to the headquarters building. She was tall and thin, with weather-beaten hands and a sash tied with a leather cord around her waist. Dressed in men's clothing, pants, boots, a jacket cinched with a belt, a knife on her belt.
Not a decorative one, a utility knife.
She was looking at Ju Han. Her gaze was direct, harsh, appraising. She looked at the pale young man riding a weary horse, at his slender hands, at the ink stains on his fingers, at the 2 trunks of books tied to the pack horse. And on her face he read exactly what he'd expected. Contempt. The quiet, weary contempt of a person who'd been dragging a crumbling garrison on her back for 3 years, and now, finally, help had been sent. And this was what that help looked like. Ju Han dismounted. He straightened up. He looked at her. "You're Han Sora." She twitched her eyebrows slightly. She hadn't expected him to know her name. She nodded briefly. He continued. "The daughter of Garrison Commander Han Tae-ju, the de facto commander of the garrison for the past 3 years. She clenched her jaw. The word de facto stung. De facto because de jure a woman cannot hold a military position. De facto because nobody cares. She said nothing. She waited. Ju Han looked around. He looked at the walls, at the barracks, at the chickens in the courtyard, then back at her. "How many people are in the garrison?" She didn't answer right away. She weighed whether it was worth answering. She decided it was. She said, 312 on the roster, 241 present. The rest are on detail or have deserted. Ju Han nodded. 241. He'd expected worse. In his past life, when he'd passed through here, there had been about 600. But that was a long time ago. He asked about their weapons. Han Sora looked at him as if he were asking if there was water in the desert. She answered briefly. "The spears are old. There are few bows, even fewer arrows. The officers have swords. The rank-and-file soldiers have clubs and knives. Only those who brought their own have armor." Ju Han listened, his face impassive. Inside, he was calculating. The spears can be repaired. Bows can be made from local wood. Arrows, too. Swords aren't the main thing. The main thing is discipline. Discipline. Food. He asked about provisions. For the first time during the entire conversation, Han Sora showed something other than contempt. For a second, anger flashed in her eyes, not at him, but at the situation. She said that the supply convoy from the capital had been delayed for 4 months. The last one arrived in the winter. Half the grain was rotten.
The other half had been taken by the provincial governor's detachment as they passed through.
The garrison subsisted on hunting and whatever they could buy in the surrounding villages. There's almost no money. Ju Han nodded. He took a bag of salt out of his saddlebag, the one he'd bought in Cheongju, and set it on the ground in front of her. "This is for you." She looked at the bag, then at him. For the first time, something stirred in her expression. Not gratitude, surprise. The boy inspector from the capital had brought salt. Not papers, not decrees, not fine words. Salt. She picked up the bag. It was heavy. Full. Good salt. She nodded. She didn't say thank you out loud, but she nodded differently than before. Ju Han noticed the difference. He asked to be shown the fortress. Han Sora led him through Hamju. They walked along the walls. through the barracks, through the kitchen, through the smithy, which had been cold for half a year because the blacksmith had died and they hadn't found a replacement, through the stable, where 14 horses stood, 8 of which were rideable, through the granary, which was a quarter full. Ju-han walked and looked. He was silent. He didn't comment. He didn't shake his head. He didn't sigh. He just looked. Han-soru walked beside him and watched him. She waited. She waited for the moment when the city boy would grimace, or say something stupid, or get scared and ask to be sent back. She was waiting to confirm what she'd already decided about him the very first second. He didn't grimace. He didn't say anything stupid. He wasn't scared. He was examining every corner with the quiet, methodical attention she'd only seen in one type of person. Those who know what they're looking at. They reached the wall above the western gate. There was an observation deck here. Ju-han stood at the edge and looked west. Hills. Dry yellow grass. Wind. Far off on the horizon, a line that could have been mountains or clouds. Beyond that line lay the steppe. Beyond the steppe, Tarkan. He stood and looked. The wind ruffled his hair, fine, boyish hair. Han-soru stood behind him, and for the first time she couldn't make sense of what she was seeing before her. The boys stood on the wall of a ruined fortress, gazing westward with an expression she couldn't read. Not fear, not curiosity, not indifference. Something else. If she'd known the word, she would have said it was recognition.
Like a person who had returned to a place they'd been to long ago and saw that everything had changed.
But she didn't know that word for that moment, so she simply stood there and watched. Ju-han turned to her. He said in an even voice, "I need to see your father." She nodded. She led him to the commandant's house. The house stood in a far corner of the fortress. Small, stone, with a front garden where nothing grew. They went inside. A dark hallway. The smell of medicine and old age. A room. Han Tae-ju was lying on the bed. An old man. Once a large man. Now withered. His skin was yellow. His eyes were cloudy. He turned his head when they entered. He looked at Ju-han. Han-sora said that a new inspector had arrived, from the capital, Prince Ju-han. The old commandant looked at the young man, for a long time. Then he raised his hand, thin and bony, and reached out to him. Ju-han stepped forward and took his hand in both of his own. The hand was cold and light, the hand of a dying man. Han Tae-ju spoke. His voice was quiet and raspy. He said he'd been waiting for a replacement for 3 years. He'd written to the capital. He'd asked. No one replied. Then he stopped writing. Then he stopped getting up. His daughter does everything. Everything he's supposed to do. She's a good commander, better than he ever was. But the Empire won't let her command, because she's a woman. He coughed for a long time. Han-soru stepped toward him. She handed him some water. He took a sip. He continued. He asked Ju-han to take care of the garrison and of his daughter. Ju-han stood there. He held the old commandant's hand. He looked into his eyes. He saw a man whom the Empire had broken. Not through war, through indifference. 30 years of service, 3 wounds, 2 medals that no one remembers, and a slow death on a forgotten frontier in a fortress the capital had written off. He'd seen hundreds of people like this in a past life. Old commanders who'd given everything and received nothing in return. He replied, "I'll take care of it." 2 words, quietly.
No drama. Han Tae-ju looked at him. For a second, his cloudy eyes cleared. He saw something in the young man's face, something that shouldn't have been there. Then his eyes clouded over again. His hand went limp. He closed his eyes. He fell asleep. Han Soru stood by the wall. She heard the boy, the inspector, say one word to her father. "I'll take care of it." He didn't promise. He didn't swear. He just said it, like a fact. She didn't know what to make of it. They left the room. They stood in the hallway. Han Soru was silent.
Ju-han was silent.
Then he said, "I need a room and access to the garrison's archives. All reports from the last 5 years. Personnel rosters, food supply records, weapons inventory, horse registry, maps of the surrounding area." She looked at him. He listed the documents like someone who knew exactly what records existed at the garrison, not like a bureaucrat reading from a list, but like a commander who knew exactly what he needed to take command. She didn't say this out loud, but she thought it. She nodded. She showed him his room. Small, clean, a table, a bed, a window facing west. His first morning in Hamju began with porridge. Ju-han woke up before dawn. He left his room. He walked down the dark hallway to the kitchen. The kitchen was an annex to the barracks. Stone walls, a soot-stained ceiling, 2 cauldrons, one with a crack. The old cook was sleeping on a bench against the wall. Ju-han didn't wake him. He found a sack of millet. He found water. He lit a fire in the hearth. His hands remembered. Not Ju-han's hands. Li Mu-heng's hands. The marshal of the Northern Gate knew how to cook porridge for 500 people. For 200, all the more so. He rinsed the millet, poured it into the cauldron, filled it with water, added salt from the sack he'd brought. Salt changes everything. Porridge without salt is just fodder. Porridge with salt is a meal. The fire roared to life. The water began to hiss. The cook woke up at the sound. He sat down on a bench and stared at the pale young man standing by the cauldron with a ladle. The young man turned toward him and asked where the dried turnips were. The cook silently pointed to the sack in the corner. Ju-han took out the turnips, chopped them finely and tossed them into the cauldron. He found some wild garlic. He crushed 3 cloves with the back of his knife and tossed them in after the turnips. The porridge thickened. The aroma filled the kitchen. A simple smell. Hot millet with salt and garlic. Nothing special. But for people who had been eating stale, cold porridge for months, this smell was like a celebration. The first soldier came in, drawn by the smell 10 minutes later. He peeked into the kitchen. He saw an unfamiliar young man standing by the cauldron. He froze. Ju-han turned around. He looked at him. Young, about 20. Skinny, sleepy eyes, bandages on his feet instead of boots. Ju-han told him to sit down. He poured a bowl of porridge, set it in front of him.
The soldier sat down, took a spoon, ate the first spoonful.
Looked up. He looked at the young man by the cauldron. Ju-han was already pouring a second bowl. A second soldier arrived a minute later. A third followed. By dawn, 30 people were sitting in the kitchen. They ate in silence. The porridge was simple but hot, and salty, and with garlic. Some ate so quickly that they burned their mouths, not out of greed, out of hunger. Ju-han stood by the pot and served everyone, silently. He looked into the face of everyone who approached with a bowl. He memorized them. He knew their names from the lists he'd read the night before. He was starting to learn their faces now. He linked a name to each face. Age, length of service, where they were from, what they could do. 30 faces in a single morning. 167 left. Han Soru arrived when the porridge was almost gone. She stood in the doorway. She watched. The young inspector, who had arrived yesterday with trunks full of books, was standing by the cauldron with his sleeves rolled up, handing out food to the soldiers. She didn't understand. She couldn't wrap her head around it. A prince from the capital, standing by the cauldron, cooking porridge for the soldiers. Ju-han noticed her. He poured a bowl, held it out. She didn't take it. She stood there, watching. He set the bowl on the edge of the table next to her. He said quietly, "You cough in the mornings. Something hot helps." He walked back to the cauldron. She stood there for another minute. Then she sat down, took the bowl, ate it. The porridge was good. After breakfast, he asked Han Sora to gather everyone in the fortress. Not in formation, just to gather them in the courtyard. She looked at him doubtfully, but she gathered them. 183 people stood in the courtyard of Hamju Fortress, not in formation, in a crowd. Everyone dressed as they pleased. Half were unarmed, a quarter were barefoot. Ju-han stepped out onto the porch of the headquarters building. He looked at them. 183 pairs of eyes stared at the pale young man, without interest, without hope, with the dull indifference of people who, long ago, stopped caring who stood before them. He did not speech. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't explain who he was or why he had come. Instead, he called out 12 names. 12 soldiers who were missing from the ranks but still appeared on the rosters. Dead souls.
Those whose pay was being collected by someone else.
The crowd froze. He named those who were taking money for the dead. 3 people, 2 foremen and 1 clerk. He named the amounts. He named the dates, precisely, based on the reports he'd read through in a single night. The silence was so thick you could hear the wind scraping against the stone wall. The 3 people he'd named were standing in the crowd. One turned pale. The second began to back away. The third, the clerk, opened his mouth to say. Ju-han didn't let him speak. He said in an even voice that, starting today, pay would be handed out personally by the inspector to each soldier, according to the list, by name. Anyone who didn't come to collect their pay would be struck off the list. Anyone who was dead would be struck off the list. Anyone who had deserted would be struck off the list. The money intended souls would go toward purchasing food for the living. He turned and walked back to headquarters. The crowd stood in silence. Then they began to whisper. Then they began to murmur. Han Soru stood by the wall and watched him go. She had known about the dead souls for 3 years. For 3 years she hadn't been able to do anything because the foreman outranked her, and she technically held no rank at all. The boy had arrived yesterday. He'd read through the reports in a single night, and in a minute he'd done what she hadn't been able to do in 3 years. She didn't know how she felt. Anger that she hadn't been able to do it herself. Relief that someone had finally done it. Wariness, because a boy who works like that can't just be a boy. She found him at headquarters an hour later. He was sitting at a table. Maps of the surrounding area lay before him, old ones, inaccurate ones. He was studying them with the expression of someone reading a poorly written letter, understanding what it was about, but annoyed by the mistakes. She sat down across from him. He looked up. He looked at her. She asked directly, "Who are you?" He replied, "Food inspector." She shook her head. She said that food inspectors don't diagnose a horse's illness by looking at its hoof. They don't cook porridge for 200 people. They don't read garrison reports as if they were battle reports. Ju-han looked at her. Han Sora, 19 years old, 3 years without help.
No rank, no recognition. For 3 years she'd kept this garrison going on sheer stubbornness. She was the first to get up, the last to go to bed.
She patched the walls with her own hands, counted the grain, broke up fights between drunk soldiers, wrote reports that no one read, and not once in 3 years had anyone told her she was doing a good job. He said, "Your reports from the last 3 years are the best of all the border reports I've seen. Accurate, honest, no embellishments. You didn't hide problems. You recorded every loss and every shortage. That's not the work of an administrator. That's the work of a commander." She froze. 3 years. For 3 years she'd been writing those reports, sending them to the capital. Not a single reply had come. And now this young man from the capital was sitting across from her, telling her he'd read them and seen them. She turned away, quickly, so he wouldn't see her eyes. He saw them, but he didn't say anything. He lowered his gaze to the maps. He gave her a minute. Then he spoke about the mission. He said he needed her help. Not an order, a request. He needed to know the terrain. Every trail, every water source, every village within a 3 days' journey. She knows it better than any map because she's been traveling the countryside for 3 years. She turned back around. Her eyes were dry. Her face was set. She nodded. They worked until evening. She spoke. He listened and drew on a blank sheet of paper, a new map, more precise than the one lying before him, with the notes she provided. Here's a spring. Here's a ford. Here's the trail used by the Tarkan scouts. Here's a village that pays tribute to both the Empire and the steppe. Here's a pass through which cavalry can be led. Here's a narrow gorge where 100 men can hold off 1,000. He drew, and she watched him draw. Not like a bureaucrat jotting things down for a report, like a man who sees the terrain in his mind's eye, who understands what every trail and every ford means, who looks at the gorge on the map and thinks not about how beautiful it is, but how many soldiers it would take to hold it. She didn't say this out loud, but she understood it. By evening, the map of Hamju County lay before them, rough, incomplete, but alive. A map that contained not only lines, but also meaning. Juhan rolled up the map. He looked at Hansora. He said that tomorrow they would go to survey the surroundings, together. She nodded. She stood up. She walked toward the door. She paused. Without turning around, she said, "The porridge was good." She left. Juhan sat alone in headquarters. It was getting dark outside the window. The wind rattled the shutters. He looked at the map. He didn't see lines. He saw the future. In 2.5 years, the Tarkan cavalry would march through the Sobek Pass. There it was on the map. Narrow, rocky, sheer cliffs. A place where 10,000 could be stopped by 500 if you knew how. He knew how. But that was a long way off. Right now, he had 183 soldiers without boots, an empty smithy, 2 months' worth of food, and one 19-year-old girl who, for the first time in 3 years, ate hot porridge and said it was good. The foundation had been laid. The next morning, he cooked porridge again, and the next, and the one after that. Every day. He'd get up before dawn, go to the kitchen, cook, serve it out. The soldiers got used to it within a week. They stopped being surprised. They started coming earlier. They started waiting, not for the porridge, for him. The young man standing by the pot, serving each one personally. The one who remembers their names. The one who asks how they slept, how their leg is, how their wife is, how their child is. He asked and remembered the answers, not out of calculation,
although out of calculation too. But not only that. He remembered how, in a past life, he'd stood before a formation of 200,000 men and didn't know a single name. He knew the regiment numbers. He knew the officers' last names, but he didn't know the soldiers. They were numbers, units, a resource. And that resource betrayed him. Not because it wanted to betray him. Because a resource neither betrays nor remains loyal. A resource simply exists or it doesn't. People are a different matter. People you know by name won't run away, not because they can't, because they don't want to let down the one who knows their name. Within 2 weeks, he knew everyone. 183 people. Names, ages, where they're from, who's married, who has children, who's sick, who drinks, who can shoot a bow, who holds a spear correctly, who fights well, who cooks, who mends clothes, who knows the local trails. Every person is a set of skills and weaknesses. A marshal sees an army. A commander sees people. He decided to become a commander. By the 3rd week, he had taken over the blacksmith shop. The blacksmith had died 6 months earlier. Some of the tools had been sold. The forge was cold. The anvil was still there, heavy. No one had been able to move it to sell it.
Juhan inspected the smithy and found that half the tools were still there: a hammer, pliers, and a chisel. What was missing were bellows for the forge and a set of files. He sent Park Dong-soo to the nearest county town to buy them. They barely had enough money. Then he found a man among the soldiers named Cho Dong-ho, 35 years old, a former blacksmith's apprentice before he was drafted into the army. Juhan put him to work in the smithy. He told him to start learning all over again. A month in Hamju. The fortress was changing. Slowly. Not from the outside. From the inside. The walls were still crumbling. The south tower was still roofless. The gates were still hanging crookedly. But the people inside the walls had changed. Not all at once. Little by little. The soldier who a month ago had been wrapped in bandages was now wearing boots. Old boots. Patched, but boots nonetheless. Juhan found 3 men among the soldiers who knew how to sew leather. He put them to work repairing the boots. In a village 2 days' journey away, he found a tanner who sold them leather in exchange for protection from small bands of raiders. That protection cost 10 soldiers, who patrolled the village once a week. The leather cost 40 pairs of soles a month. The math of war. Resources in exchange for resources. He was rebuilding the garrison just as one builds a house. The foundation comes first. Food, footwear, tools. Without a foundation, walls won't stand. Without well-fed and well-shod soldiers, no tactic works. Cho Dong-ho's smithy was now operating every day. 3 spearheads were produced each day. Rough but sturdy. Juhan taught the blacksmith a hardening technique he remembered from the field workshops at the Northern Gate. A simple technique. Heat it until it turns cherry red. Dip it in oil, then in water. Then let it cool in the air. The tip turned out harder than with ordinary forging. Cho Dong-ho mastered the technique in a week and no longer asked how the inspector knew about forging. In the 6th week, Juhan rode out of the fortress on a reconnaissance mission. He took Park Dong-soo and 10 soldiers with him. Han Soru rode along uninvited. She simply mounted a horse and settled in beside him. He didn't object. They rode westward, toward the Sobek Pass. It was a 3-day journey. The road wound through dry hills. The grass was yellow. The rocks were grey. The wind blew constantly. There were no trees or cover. It was open terrain, ideal for cavalry but poor for infantry. Juhan looked around and committed everything to memory. Every hill, every hollow, every rock behind which an archer could hide. In his mind, the map of the future overlaid the map of the present.
In 2 years and 2 months, the Tarkhan cavalry would march along this road. 70,000 horsemen. They would pass through the Sobek Pass and emerge onto this plain. In his past life, the Imperial Army had met them on the plain near Gyeongsu, open ground, cavalry against cavalry. Tarhan won because Hwang I-ryon had pulled back his flank. But what if the battle had taken place not on the plain, but in a gorge? What if someone had intercepted them earlier, in a narrow passage where numerical superiority doesn't matter? The Sobek Pass. They reached it on the 3rd day. Juhan dismounted at the entrance to the gorge. He stood and looked. The gorge was long, narrow. The walls were rocky, almost sheer. The floor was rocky. At its narrowest point, it was 40 paces wide. Cavalry could only pass 4 abreast. He walked through the gorge on foot, from one end to the other. He counted his steps. He measured the width. He looked at the walls. He searched for ledges, clearings, places where archers could be positioned, places where rocks could be dropped, places where the passage could be blocked with a barricade. Khan Soru followed behind him. She was silent. She watched. He walked through the gorge as a commander surveys a future battlefield. He stopped. He looked up. He squinted. He touched a rock. He chipped off a piece. He crumbled it between his fingers. He examined the rock. Granite. Strong. It wouldn't collapse on its own. But with a little help. If he undercut the base first, if he wedged wooden wedges into the cracks and poured water into them before the frost set in, the water would freeze. It would expand. The rock would crack. An old method from mountain warfare. Slow but reliable. He walked through the gorge twice. On the way back, he stopped at the narrowest point. 40 paces. He looked at Han Sora. He said, "Here." She didn't ask what was here. She understood. Here they could stop the army. They returned to Hamju 3 days later. Juhan shut himself away in headquarters and drew. Not a map. A plan. A plan to defend the Sobek Gorge, with calculations, the number of men for each position, the number of arrows, the number of rocks for a landslide, the number of days for preparation.
Everything. He worked for 3 days without leaving headquarters. Han Soru brought him food. She set it on the edge of the table. She took away the empty bowls. She didn't say a word. She saw his eyes, the eyes of a man who sees something others don't, and who draws it on paper so that others can see it too. On the 4th day, he came out. He called for Park Dong-soo and Han Sora. He laid out the plan. He explained it. He spoke for an hour, calmly, methodically, like a teacher who knows the subject so well that he can explain it to a child. 3 lines of defense in the gorge. The first at the entrance, a barricade of stones, 20 spearmen. Their task is to hold off the vanguard for half an hour and then retreat. The second in the middle of the gorge, archers on the ledges, rocks prepared to be dropped. The main force. The objective is to inflict maximum damage and force the enemy to stop. The third is at the narrowest point, the final line of defense. Here, 20 men can hold the pass for a day. Khan Soru listened. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was silent for a minute. Then she asked one question. "Against whom?" Chu Han looked at her. He paused. Then he answered, "Against the Tarhan." She wasn't surprised. She had lived on the western border for 3 years. She had seen Tarhan scouts. She had seen their numbers grow with each passing year. She had seen the campfires rising in the steppe beyond the horizon. She knew there would be a war. She just didn't know when. Chu Han said, 3 months is 70 days of training,
if you subtract the rainy days and the days when people are busy with farm work. 70 days to turn peasants and pampered garrison idlers into soldiers who won't run away at the sight of cavalry. Lee Mu-hyung knew that was impossible. A real soldier takes a year to train, a good one 3, an excellent one 5 years of continuous service. But he didn't need excellent soldiers. He needed people who could do 3 things: stand in formation, hold a spear, and not run away. 3 things. Simple. But it is precisely these 3 things that distinguish an army from a crowd. He started with the first, formation. Every morning after their jog, he lined the men up in the courtyard, shoulder to shoulder, rows of 10. Stand. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10, 20. Stand and don't move. The soldiers grumbled. They didn't understand why. He didn't explain. After a week, they stopped grumbling. After 2 weeks, they began to stand straight. After 3 weeks, their shoulders aligned without a command.
Their bodies had grown accustomed to formation. Muscle memory. A man who has stood in formation 1,000 times will stand in formation even under a hail of arrows. Not because he is brave, because his body knows what to do, and his mind doesn't have time to object. Second, the spear. Cho Dong-ho forged the spearheads. The shafts were cut from mountain ash. Park Dong-soo found a grove half a day's journey from the fortress. Ash is strong and flexible, a good wood for spears. He brought back logs. The soldiers shaped them according to a template, 3 paces long. The thickness was about the width of a palm. The tip was attached to the shaft and wrapped with wet leather. The leather dried. It tightened. The tip sat firmly in place. An old field method. He taught them how to hold a spear, not to fence, but to hold it, to plant the blunt end in the ground, to point the tip forward, to angle it toward the ground, and to stand. A mounted soldier won't charge a wall of spears. A horse is smarter than its rider. A horse won't step onto a spear tip. The rider can give the order. The horse will refuse. That means the cavalry will stop. And a stopped cavalry is a sitting duck. Third, don't run. The hardest part. People run out of fear. Fear kills faster than an arrow. Entire armies have perished not at the hands of the enemy, but because of panic. The formation broke down. People fled and they were cut down from behind. He couldn't teach them not to be afraid, but he could teach them to trust one another. A man doesn't run if he knows the man to his right won't run, and the man to his right doesn't run if he knows the man to his left is holding his ground. A chain of trust. He built it slowly. Partner drills. 2 people stand back to back, one with his spear pointing forward, the other with his spear pointing backward. Hold your position. Don't turn around. Trust the one behind you. A simple exercise. But after a month, the people who stood back to back began to look at each other differently. Not as they would look at fellow soldiers, but as they would look at those to whom they entrusted their backs. Kan Soru watched the training sessions. The first week, she stood on the sidelines, arms crossed, silent. By the second week, she began to help. She corrected their stances. She yelled at those who were slacking off. Her voice was louder than any sergeant's. The soldiers obeyed her, not because she was the commandant's daughter,
Because for 3 years she had been the only person who cared about them. They knew that. And they knew that the young inspector listened to her. That meant she was important, so they had to listen properly.
Ju Han watched her work. He saw how she moved among the soldiers, confidently, naturally, like someone born for this. She was a commander, a true one, not by rank but by nature. She lacked knowledge, tactics, strategy, but her commander's instinct was innate. She could tell who was tired, who was faking it, who was at their limit, who could still go on. She knew when to push and when to back off. You can't learn that from books. You're born with it. He began giving her assignments, not orders, requests. Take 20 men. Lead them on a march to the river and back. Time it. Take 10 archers. Set up targets 100 paces away. Have them shoot until they run out of arrows. Record who hit the target and how many times. She carried them out. Precisely. Quickly. Without mistakes. She returned with her report. She reported concisely and to the point, like an officer. He listened, nodded, gave the next assignment. A rhythm developed between them. Not friendship, not subordination. A working partnership between two people who respected each other's competence. She didn't know who he was, but she knew he wasn't who he claimed to be. And she kept quiet, because the result was more important than the secret. At the end of his second month in Hamju, he traveled to the county seat, a 2-day journey, the city of Cheongju, that very same half-empty little town through which he had passed through on his way here. He had 2 tasks. First, to stock up on provisions, grain, salt, and dried meat. He had spent almost all the money from the salaries of the dead souls. The supply train from the capital wouldn't arrive. He knew that. He could only count on himself. Second, people. He was looking for specific people, those cast aside by the empire, those he needed just as much as soldiers. A female apothecary. In the county town lived a girl named Solmir, 17 years old, the daughter of a military doctor executed for the alleged poisoning of a high-ranking official. He knew of her from a past life. In that life, she had become one of the best field medics in the Northern Army. But it was too late. Much too late. The Tarkan detachment arrived in early fall, just as Han Soru had said.
The sentry on the southern tower spotted dust on the horizon 2 hours before their arrival.
He ran to headquarters. He reported, "Cavalry from the west, about 30 horsemen." Zhu Han nodded. He stood up from the table. He went out into the courtyard. He looked up at the sky. Clear, no wind. A good day. He had been preparing for this for 3 months. The plan was simple. Don't attack. Don't fight. Intercept them. The Tarkan detachment was heading toward the village near the Tonju fortress to collect tribute. They didn't know there was now a garrison in the village, 20 soldiers from Hamju plus 20 local militiamen. 40 men. Not many against 30 horsemen. But the salted soldiers were stationed behind the walls, and cavalry can't take walls. Juhan summoned Han Sora. He spoke briefly. "They're heading for Tonju. We're going out." She nodded. She didn't ask for the plan. She already knew it. They discussed it 3 weeks ago. An hour later, 80 soldiers left Hamju. 80 out of 197. The rest stayed behind to defend the fortress. 80 men, on foot, with spears. 12 archers. 1 food inspector riding a gelding. 1 old stable hand by his side. 1 19-year-old girl with a sword at her belt. 1 17-year-old apothecary carrying a sack of bandages on her back. They marched quickly, a forced march. 12 hours to Tonju. Juhan had calculated it. The Tarkan detachment would reach the village by the morning of the next day. They had to get there first. The soldiers marched, not in formation, in a column, but they marched in unison. 3 months of training had paid off. No one fell behind. No one complained. Their feet were shod, spears on their shoulders, water flasks, hardtack in their bags. Juhan walked on foot. He had given his horse to Solmir, along with her sacks of medicine. He walked alongside the soldiers. His breathing was steady. His lungs ached but didn't burn. His body had grown stronger during those 4 months in Hamju. It hadn't become strong. It had become resilient. That's an important difference. A strong person can lift a heavy load.
A resilient person can walk all day. They reached Tonju 3 hours before dawn. The village was asleep. The garrison in the fortress was awake. The corporal, commanding 20 soldiers, met them at the gate. He reported that the Tarkan detachment had been spotted by a patrol about 10 li to the west. They had set up camp for the night.
They'll arrive in the morning. Juhan nodded. He entered the fortress. He inspected the walls, the gates, and the defensive positions. The fortress was small. The walls were low, but it stood on a hill. It could only be approached from one side. The slopes are steep. Cavalry won't climb the slope. They'll approach along the road. The road is narrow, 4 abreast. He positioned his men. 40 spearmen at the gates, in 3 rows, spears forward. 12 archers on the walls, the rest in reserve in the courtyard. Militiamen from the village were also in the courtyard, armed with axes and pitchforks. Not on the front lines. They aren't ready. But their presence is important. They're defending their homes. That's a motivation no amount of training can provide. Khan Soru commanded the archers. He stationed her on the wall. From there, she can see the entire field. She'll be his eyes. Park Dong-su stood next to him, at the gate, with an old sword he'd found in Hamju's armory. The sword was dull and rusty, but in the hands of a former squad leader, even a dull sword is dangerous. So Mire was sitting inside the fortress, in a room that had been turned into a field hospital. She laid out her instruments, cut up bandages, boiled water. Her hands didn't tremble. Her face was pale but calm. She was the daughter of a military doctor. She knew what to do. Dawn. Juhan stood on the wall and looked west. Dust, in the distance, slowly approaching. Cavalry. He counted by the dust. About 30, just as they'd said. Light cavalry, without armor, with bows and sabers. Raiders, not an army, a gang on the state payroll. They rode up to the village, stopped, saw the banner on the fortress tower, the banner of the empire. It had been rehoisted yesterday, not faded, brand new. Khan Soru had sewn it from fabric that Juhan had bought in Cheongju. The Tarkan horsemen sat on their horses and looked at the banner, then at the fortress, then at one another. They hadn't expected any resistance. For 3 years they had come and taken whatever they wanted. The village paid. The fortress was empty. But now there were people on the walls with spears and bows, and the banner was flying. The commander of the detachment rode forward. After Tonju, the days flew by. Autumn brought cold weather and work. Juhan didn't stop for a single day. Hamju Fortress was changing. The walls were repaired in 3 places. The southern tower was given a new roof. The gates were hung level. The blacksmith shop worked from dawn to dusk. Cho Dong-ho is no longer alone. He has 2 apprentices from among the soldiers.
They forge spearheads, horseshoes, nails and hinges, simple things. But without the simple things, the complex ones don't work. People were arriving, slowly, 1 or 2 at a time, peasants from the surrounding villages. Word had spread. In Hamju, they feed you. In Hamju, they protect you. In Hamju, there's a strange boy inspector who knows everyone by name and cooks porridge. By the end of fall, the garrison had grown to 320 men. Not many, but twice as many as before. And the quality was different. These were no longer just garrison idlers. These were people who ran every morning, who stood at attention every day, who held their spears correctly, who knew the person next to them in the ranks, who trusted him with their backs. Not an army, but the embryo of an army. In mid-fall, Juhan found the 2nd person on his list, Yun Hei-in, a cartographer. He knew where she was, at the county library, a 2-day journey to the east,
in the town of Munju, small and quiet. The library was in an old temple that had been converted into a scroll repository. He went alone. Park Dong-soo wanted to go with him. Ju-han said no. Park Dong-soo was needed at the fortress. Han So-ru could lead the training, but Park Dong-soo needed to be by her side, as a pillar of support, as her second set of eyes. He went alone. 2 days on horseback. His body held up. His lungs didn't burn. His legs didn't tremble. 4 months of training and marching had transformed a frail boy into a thin but sinewy young man. Not a warrior, but a man who could spend a day in the saddle without falling off. Yun Hei-in was sitting in the library at a table piled high with scrolls. He saw her through the window before he entered. Small, slouching. Her hair was tied in a bun with strands sticking out in all directions. Her fingers were stained with ink. She was copying a scroll. Slowly, carefully. She was squinting, nearsighted. He walked in. She looked up. She looked at him with eyes clouded from long hours of reading. He told her who he was, the food inspector for Hamju County. She wasn't impressed. A food inspector, a lowly bureaucrat from the sticks. Why had he come? He asked if he could see her maps. She tensed. Maps. Those very maps that had gotten her expelled from the Academy of Celestial Knowledge. Maps of the western border, pinpointing weak spots in the defenses. Maps that the court had called defeatist. Maps for which she had been branded a traitor. She asked why he wanted the maps.
He said he wanted to see the map of the Sobek Pass. She paused. Then she pulled a rolled-up scroll from under the table. Large, heavy. She unrolled it. A map of the Sobek Pass. Detailed, precise, marking every ledge, every crevice, every water source, with notes on the width of the passage at every point, with calculations of how many people could pass through in an hour at the narrowest point. Ju-han stared at the map, in silence, for a long time. It was the best map he'd seen in 2 lifetimes, more accurate than the maps drawn by his staff officers in his past life, more accurate than anything he'd seen in the Imperial Archives. A girl from a provincial academy had drawn a map that was worth more than the entire cartographic department of the General Staff. He raised his head. He looked at her. She was standing across from him, waiting. She was used to people looking at her maps and saying they were alarmist, or unnecessary, or dangerous. He stood up. He bowed to her. A prince bowed to a scribe. Deeply, with respect that couldn't be feigned. She recoiled. She hadn't expected it. He said that her map of the Sobek Pass would save 200,000 lives. He said he needed her, not the map, her, the person who sees the terrain as no one else does, the person who can map out a war before it even begins. Yun Hee-in looked at him. Her lips trembled. 3 years. For 3 years she had sat in this library, copying other people's scrolls in exchange for food. For 3 years her work had gathered dust under the table. For 3 years no one had said her maps were needed. And now the boy was kneeling before her, telling her that her map would save 200,000 lives. She began to cry. Quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks and dripped onto the map. He waited. He didn't rush her. He didn't try to comfort her. He gave her time. She wiped her eyes with her sleeve, smearing ink across her cheek. She looked at him with tear-filled eyes. She nodded. They left Munju the next morning. Yun Hei-in rode a mule. 3 rolled-up scrolls with maps were tied to the saddle. The rest of her belongings fit into a single bag. She spoke little. She looked around. She memorized the terrain, a cartographer's habit. Every hill, every bend in the road, every stream settled in her mind like a line on a map. Ju-han rode beside her. He was silent. He was thinking. 2 people from the list had been found, So-mi-rae and Yoon-hae-in.
3 remained: Je-hani, the mercenary, Park Un-ju, the village headman's daughter, and Myung-hwa Son, the daughter of the great house. Each would come in her own time, neither sooner nor later. There was no need to rush. They arrived in Hamju 2 days later. Han So-ru met them at the gate. She looked at Yoon-hae-in, small, nearsighted, with ink stains on her face. Not a soldier, not a warrior, a scholar. Han So-ru looked at Ju-han. He said, "Our cartographer." Han So-ru nodded. No questions asked. She was getting used to it. The inspector brings strange people. An apothecary, a cartographer. Every time they turn out to be exactly what's needed. Every time she didn't understand how he knew. Yoon-hae-in settled into a room next to headquarters. She unfolded the maps. She laid out her tools, rulers, compasses, and 4 colors of ink. Within a day, she was already at work. Ju-han gave her an assignment, a new map of Hamju County, complete, accurate, showing every trail, every ford, every hill from which the road is visible. Yoon-hae-in nodded. She dove into her work like a diver into water, head first. Han So-ru stopped by that evening. She brought dinner. She saw the maps on the walls. She stopped. She looked at them. The map of the Sobek Pass hung on the wall opposite the window. Han So-ru had been traveling through that pass for 3 years. She knew it like the back of her hand. And for the first time, she saw it drawn so accurately that she recognized every single rock. She turned to Yoon-hae-in. The little girl was sitting at the table, drawing. She didn't look up. She didn't notice. Han So-ru set the dinner on the edge of the table. She left. She found Ju-han at headquarters. She said one word. "Where do you find them?" He looked up from his papers. He looked at her. He replied, "They've always been here. It's just that no one was looking." She stood there, pondering his words. Then she nodded and left. He was left alone. He sat at the table. 2 sheets of paper lay before him. The first was a list of what they had: 320 soldiers, 3 fortresses, a blacksmith, a doctor, a cartographer, and 2 months' worth of food supplies. Winter arrived with the wind. The west wind carried snow and cold, the cold of the steppe, dry, biting, not like in the mountains near the monastery. There it was damp and oppressive. Here it was dry and painful. The wind cut through the cracks in the walls like a knife through fabric. During the first week, 3 soldiers came down with a fever. Mireille treated them.
Decoctions made from willow bark, hot compresses, warm drinks. All 3 were back on their feet in 5 days. She knew her craft. Ju-han set to work on the walls. The cracks were patched with clay mixed with straw, an old method. Simple. It works. The doors were insulated with hides that the soldiers had taken from deer while hunting. He sent out hunting parties every 3 days. 10 men. 2 days in the hills, they returned with meat, venison, hares, and sometimes wild boar. The meat was dried and smoked, a supply for the winter. Firewood. He sent 24 men to chop wood in the grove across the river. Ash for spears and oak for the fire. Oak burns long and hot. The logs were stacked against the fortress wall. By midwinter, the woodpile stretched 20 paces long and 2 paces high, enough for 3 months if they didn't waste it. He didn't waste it. Every day he kept track of their consumption, how much firewood had been used, how much was left, and how many days remained until spring. Numbers. Trivialities. The very things that make up survival. Training continued unabated, even in the freezing cold. He cut back on the runs, replacing them with drill exercises in the courtyard, 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour after lunch. Shorter than in the summer, but every day, without exception. The soldiers grumbled less. They'd gotten used to it. Some even began to enjoy it, not the training itself, but the feeling that they were part of something, part of the formation, part of a whole that was greater than any of them. That feeling was stronger than the cold. In the depths of winter, Jehani arrived. He wasn't looking for her. She found him on her own. The Hamju Gate. Evening. Snow. A sentry on the wall shouted that a person was approaching the gate. One person. On foot. Juhan went out. A woman was standing at the gate. Tall. In a travel cloak caked with snow. Her hood pulled down. 2 short swords on her back. An amulet around her neck. Silver. She pulled back her hood. Her face was weather-beaten. High cheekbones. Eyes with an Altoan slant. Half-blood. She said she was looking for work. She'd heard they were hiring in Hamju. Juhan looked at her. Jehani. 24 years old. A mercenary of northern origin. In her past life, she had been one of the best swordswomen in his army. She had commanded the marshal's personal guard. She died at Gyeongsu while covering his retreat. He remembered how she fell, with 2 swords in her hands, a smile on her face.
She didn't know him. To her, he was just a familiar boy at the fortress gates. He invited her inside, fed her, hot porridge, meat, tea. She ate greedily. It had been a long time since she'd eaten anything hot. He sat across from her and waited. When she finished eating, he asked about the amulet. He named it correctly, an Alto amulet, northern-crafted silver. He asked if she'd gotten it from her mother or her grandmother. She froze with the spoon in her hand. She looked at him. Her eyes were narrow, wary. No one in the empire could tell Alto silver from ordinary silver. No one knew what an Alto amulet looked like. She asked how he knew. He said he'd lived in the north for a long time. She didn't believe him. The boy was 17. How long could he have lived in the north? But she didn't argue. He offered her a job, not as a mercenary, commander of a guard squad, a salary, food, lodging, and one condition. Here they would call her by her name, Jehani. Not a mercenary, not a half-breed, by her name. She looked at him for a long time. Then she smiled. She said she wouldn't ask for much in exchange for her name. He didn't smile. He said seriously that a name was worth more than anything. She stopped smirking. She nodded. She stayed. A week later, she was already putting a squad of soldiers through their paces in the courtyard. Roughly, no mercy. She fought fiercely. The 2 short swords in her hands moved so fast that the eye couldn't keep up. The soldiers watched with their mouths agape. Han Soru watched with respect. So Mire watched with fear. Yun Hein didn't watch at all. She was drawing a map. Juhan watched and saw what the others didn't. Jehani didn't move like a trained fighter. She moved like someone who had grown up in battle. She had started fighting before she even learned to read. Her body remembered combat as naturally as breathing. That's not something you can train for. You're either born with it or die young. She was born with it. Winter dragged on. The garrison held firm. There was enough food. There was enough firewood. People weren't getting sick. So Mire kept an eye on everyone's health. Hot herbal decoctions, herbal compresses. She walked through the barracks every evening, checking, asking, who was coughing, who had a stomachache, whose toes were going numb. Little things. But it's the little things that make for a healthy garrison. That winter, Juhan found a 5th person, Park Unju. He didn't go looking for her. She came on her own, or rather, her father brought her. The village headman from a village an hour's walk from Hamju, an old farmer with heavy hands and a guilty expression. He brought his daughter. She had a round face. She was shy, with large hands and downcast eyes. He said his daughter could count, that ever since childhood she'd been the fastest at counting in the village, that she'd found a shortage in the granary that the former tax collector had hidden. He said the tax collector found out and threatened the family. He asked that his daughter be admitted to the fortress for protection. Ju-han looked at the girl, 18 years old, quiet, frightened, her hands pressed against her body, her eyes fixed on the floor. He asked the village head to step out. He remained alone with her. He asked gently, "What is 317 multiplied by 43? She looked up. She looked at him for the first time. She answered after 2 seconds. 13,631. He checked in his head. Correct. He asked another question. If there were 800 sacks in the granary, and 47 sacks are used up each month while 32 are brought in, how many months will it take for the granary to run empty? She answered after 4 seconds. 53 months and 1/3. He looked at her. She looked at him. For the first time, someone had asked her questions she knew the answers to. For the first time, someone was listening. He said he needed a quartermaster, someone who would keep track of everything: food, firewood, weapons, money, people, every sack and every nail. She would be that person. She nodded, quickly, often, just like her father. Ju-han assigned her a room next to headquarters, next to Yun-hae-in. 3 days later, Park Un-ju knew the contents of every warehouse in the fortress. A week later, she compiled a complete inventory of the property. 2 weeks later, she found a discrepancy in the old records that showed the previous clerk had taken weapons and supplies worth an amount that Ju-han preferred not to mention. He looked at her records. Neat, precise, every number in its place, every total matched. He nodded. He told her she was doing important work. She blushed to her ears. She lowered her eyes, but the corners of her lips twitched. It was the first time anyone had told her that her work was important. Winter dragged on. Blizzards alternated with clear, frosty days.
On one such night, something happened that soldiers would go on recounting for years to come. A supply convoy from the capital had been delayed for a month. Grain was running out. Pak In-ju reported there was enough for 2 weeks. If they rationed it, maybe 3. Ju-han nodded. That evening, he went to the kitchen. The cook looked at him. He knew what was coming. Ju-han took off his outer clothing. He rolled up his sleeves. He looked to see what was available. Millet. Not much. Dried turnips. A handful. Bones from yesterday's venison. Wild garlic. Salt. The last bag. He began to cook. A huge cauldron. Water. Bones. Turnips. Millet. Garlic. Salt. He cooked it for 5 hours, stirred it, tasted it, added more. The stew turned out thin. Spring came with the water. The snow melted. Streams rushed down the hills. The roads thawed. But along with the water came people. Word of Hamju had spread throughout the western provinces over the winter. The villages passed the news along to one another. There's a fortress. They feed you there. They protect you there. There's a strange boy, an inspector. People came. Peasants from ravaged villages, former soldiers discharged on medical grounds, unemployed artisans, hunters, vagabonds. Ju-han received each one personally. He looked each one in the eye. He asked each one 3 questions. Where are you from? What can you do?
Why did you come? The answers varied. The reason was the same. They had nowhere else to go. The empire had cast them out. He took them in. By mid-spring, there were already 800 people in Hamju and the 2 restored fortresses. Not all of them were soldiers. Half were militiamen, peasants with axes and pitchforks, but they were learning every day. Juhan put Han Sora in charge of training in Hamju. He sent Park Dong-su to Sanju, Jehami to Tongju. Each of them trained the men using the system he had developed, a simple system: formation, spear, shield, 3 movements, forward, backward, to the side. Nothing complicated. But they had to repeat it every day until their bodies began to do it without thinking. In the spring, he found the last person on the list. Or rather, she found him. Myung-hwa Son, 21 years old, the youngest daughter of the great house of Myung, exiled to a distant temple for knowing too much. He knew she was there, but he didn't go after her. He waited. She had to come on her own, and she did. Or rather, she sent a letter.
A thin scroll on fine paper bearing a seal that Yuhan recognized at first glance.
The seal of the Myung house, the younger branch.
The letter was short, 3 lines in perfect handwriting. She wrote that she had heard of him, that Inspector Hamju had caught the capital's attention, that Crown Prince Ju Yol had inquired about him twice, that Empress Myung had discussed him with her advisers, that Hwang Yi-yong, commander of the Western Army, had requested a report on the status of the garrisons along the western border. 3 lines. Each was worth more than a month's worth of intelligence. Juhan read it, folded it, put it away, thought. The capital knows. Hwang Yi-yon knows. It was inevitable, but sooner than he'd expected. Someone had informed on him. The Tarkans, or the merchants, or that very official Kang Pyong-su. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he now faced 2 fronts, Tarhan to the west and the capital to the east. He wrote a reply to Myung-hwa Song, a brief one, just 3 lines requesting a meeting. In a week, he would travel to the White Pine Temple, a day's journey to the east. The temple stood in the mountains, quiet, well-maintained, not like the White Crane Monastery. A wealthy temple. Myung-hwa Song was waiting for him in the garden. He saw her and paused for a second. Beautiful. Not a striking beauty, a quiet one. Her posture was perfect. Her back was straight. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her gaze was steady, cool, intelligent. She looked at him the way an appraiser looks at a stone, searching for a crack. He approached and sat down across from her. They looked at each other. 2 people who knew how to read others. She saw a young man with the face of a boy and the eyes of an old man. He saw a woman who was smarter than all her brothers and had been punished for it. He spoke first. He said he knew about her brother, that her brother had forged the seal in the year of the monkey. He said he didn't need that information. No blackmail, no threat. He simply showed that he knew, so that she would understand she was facing someone who played on the same level as she did. She didn't flinch. She just looked at him. Then she asked what he wanted. He answered with a single word. Her head. Not in the sense of execution, her mind. She knows the capital from the inside. She knows who's connected to whom, who owes what to whom, who's hiding what. He's building an army, but an army without politics is a hammer without a hand. He needs that hand. She was silent for a long time. A minute. 2. Then she smiled.
For the first time in 2 years. Not broadly, just the corners of her lips, like someone who's finally found a worthy opponent. She said his chances were slim,
He replied that slim chances were better than none at all. She nodded. She stood up. She said she'd pack her things. 3 days later, Manhwa Son arrived in Hamju. Han Soru met her at the gate. She looked at the silk dress, at the perfect posture, at the slender fingers without. She looked at Juhan. He said, "Our advisor on capital affairs." Han Soru nodded, but something flashed in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Hwang Iryon arrived in early summer, with a detachment of 50 horsemen, all in gleaming armor, thoroughbred horses. The banners of the Western Army fluttered in the wind, beautiful, elegant, useless in war. Juhan stood on the wall and watched them ride up. Han Soru stood beside him, her hand on the hilt of her sword, her jaw clenched. She knew what the commander's visit meant, an inspection, or a threat, or both. Juhan looked at the rider at the head of the detachment. Young, handsome, straight back, confident posture, an open face, a slight smile. Charming. That word suited him perfectly. Hwang Iryon, 27 years old, heir to the Hwang house, one of the 8 greats, commander of the Western Army since the age of 23. Not by talent, by birth, though he had talent too, real talent. He wasn't a mediocrity. That was precisely what made him dangerous. A talentless general is predictable. A talented but weak one is unpredictable. Juhan looked at him and saw 2 people at once. A young, brilliant commander standing at the fortress gates, smiling. And a shadow. The shadow of a man who, in 2 years, would make the decision to withdraw the cavalry. Not out of malice, not out of cowardice, out of calculation. Cold, rational calculation. If the marshal were to die, Hwang Iryon would take command. Simple, logical, monstrous. He climbed down from the wall and stepped out into the courtyard. He met Hwang Iryon at the gate. He bowed, exactly according to protocol. A prince bows to his commander, no lower, no higher. Hwang Iryon dismounted. He looked at Juhan. The smile hadn't faded, but his eyes grew more attentive. He saw a young man, pale, thin, dressed in plain clothes without any insignia, but with eyes that didn't match his face. He sensed it immediately, the incongruity. Something was off about this boy. Something too old in that young face.
They exchanged greetings, formal, proper. Juhan invited him to headquarters. Tea, conversation. Hwang Iryon sat down at the table. He looked around the room. Maps on the walls, lists, reports, a level of administrative organization he hadn't expected to see in a forgotten fortress. He asked directly, "What's going on here?" "A food inspector who's rebuilding garrisons and training soldiers. That goes beyond the scope of his duties." Juhan replied calmly. He said that as a food inspector, he was obligated to monitor the condition of the garrison as a whole. The soldiers' well-being depended on security. Security depended on training. Training depended on discipline. Everything was connected. Hwang Iryon listened. He smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. He asked to inspect the garrison. Juhan showed him around. He pointed out the walls, the barracks, the smithy, the granary, and the drill ground. Hwang Iryon watched, intently, professionally. He was a talented commander and saw what he saw. The soldiers were shod, armed, standing in formation perfectly aligned. They were looking at the inspector, not the commander. That was what mattered most. Whom do the soldiers look at when 2 officers are present? The one they consider their own. They were looking at Juhan. Hwang Iryon noticed this. His smile grew more subdued. He walked along the line.
He stopped in front of one soldier. He asked his name. The soldier answered. Hwang Irion asked how long he'd been in the service. The soldier answered. Hwang Irion asked who his commander was. The soldier answered, Inspector Ju Han. Not the squad leader. Not Han Soru. Ju Han. Hwang Irion turned to the young man. He looked at him, for a long time, without a smile. For the first time during the entire visit. Ju Han held his gaze. And at that moment, something happened. Something both of them sensed, but neither could put into words. Recognition. Not of a face, not of a name. Something deeper. Hwang Irion looked at the pale young man and felt that this young man knew something about him, something no one was supposed to know. Not a fact, not a secret. Something about his nature, about who he would become. Ju Han looked at the handsome young general and saw a shadow. The shadow of an executioner. The shadow of a traitor. The shadow of a man who had not yet made a decision but already carried it within him like a seed. They stood facing each other in the courtyard of Hamju Fortress.
The wind whipped dust between them. The soldiers stood in formation, unaware of what was happening. Han Soru stood by the wall and felt the tension like a thunderstorm before a bolt of lightning. Hwang Irion was the first to look away. His smile returned, light, familiar. Tarhan struck in the fall, half a year earlier than in his past life. It all happened quickly. A sentry at the western outpost spotted dust on the horizon. A lot of dust. Not 30 horsemen, not 100, thousands. He lit a signal fire. Smoke rose into the sky. An hour later, a second fire, on the hill near Tongju. 2 hours later, a third, near Sanju. A chain of fires stretching from west to east, a system that Ju Han had set up over the course of a year. Simple, reliable, a bonfire on every hill. 1 fire meant a reconnaissance party, 2 meant a detachment, 3 meant an army. 3 fires burned on every hill. Ju Han stood on the Hamju wall and watched the smoke. His face was calm. His hands were behind his back. The wind ruffled his hair. His men stood nearby. Han Soru with a sword at his belt, Jehani with 2 short swords on his back, Park Dong-su with an old blade. Behind them were the officers, the squad leaders, and the soldiers who had seen the smoke and come to the wall. They hadn't come in a panic. They came and stood there. They waited. They watched the young man on the wall. He turned toward them. He spoke briefly. Sobek. 1 word. They knew what it meant. He had been telling them about this for half a year. When Tarhan arrived, they would meet him in the gorge, where it was 40 paces wide and the walls reached the sky, where 1,000 could stand against 10,000. 3 hours later, Hamju's army marched out of the fortress. Not all of it. 500 of the best, trained, armed, with spears forged by Cho Dong-ho, with bows made of mountain ash, with shields fashioned from oak planks. 500 men. The other 500 remained in the fortresses, to defend, to wait, to pray. The march to Sobek took 2 days, a brisk march. The soldiers marched without complaint. They knew why they were marching. They knew where they were going. They knew what awaited them. Ju Han marched with them, on foot, as always, side by side with the soldiers. His lungs were burning. His body ached, but he marched on. And because he marched on, everyone else did too. Yun Hei-in walked beside him, with a map in her hands, one she had drawn herself, accurate down to the last rock. She knew every ledge in the gorge, every clearing, every crack into which a wedge could be driven.
Mireille walked in the supply train, carrying sacks of medicine, bandages, boiled water in water skins. Her hands didn't tremble. She knew there would be wounds, many wounds. She was ready. Park Eun-ju stayed behind in Hamju. Her place was in the fortress, to keep count, to supply, to secure the rear. She cried as they left, quietly with her back turned. Ju-han approached her before they departed. He said he would return. She nodded. She didn't believe him, but she nodded. Myung-hwa Song stayed behind too. Her task was different. She had already written a report to the capital, not on her own behalf, but on behalf of the border garrison. Tarkhan has invaded. The western border is under attack. We request assistance. She knew help wouldn't arrive in time, but the report would create a record, a document. When it was all over, this document would prove that Hamju had asked for help and the capital had not responded. Politics, even in war. They arrived at the Sobek Gorge at dawn on the third day. Ju-han entered the gorge first. He stood at the narrowest point, 40 paces, stone walls, tall, the sky a narrow strip between the cliffs, silent, only the wind in the rocks. He closed his eyes, took a breath, opened them, began to position his men. According to the plan he'd drawn up a year ago, which he'd refined month after month, which he knew by heart. 3 lines of defense. The first at the entrance, 50 spearmen behind a stone barricade. Their task? To hold off the vanguard and then fall back. The second in the middle, 200 spearmen in 2 rows, archers on the ledges, stones ready to be dropped. The main position. This is where the main battle will take place. The third line at the narrowest point, 100 men, the last line of defense. If they reach it, things are looking bad. The remaining 150 are in reserve, behind the third line, ready to plug any gap. Han Soru commanded the second line, the main one, the most dangerous one. Ju-han had placed her there. She nodded, without a word. She understood. He was entrusting her with the most important task. Jehani commanded the third line, the last line of defense. She smiled. She said she loved hopeless situations. Park Dong-soo stood next to Ju-han, as always, a shadow and a pillar of support. They waited. A day, a night, another day. At dawn on the 4th day, the earth trembled. Cavalry, a great many, thousands of hooves. The sound came from beyond the pass. It grew louder, like thunder, like an avalanche. Ju-han stood on a ledge above the second line. He looked toward the entrance to the gorge. He waited. The first Tarkhan horsemen appeared an hour later. The vanguard, light cavalry, scouts, 100 of them. They charged into the gorge at full speed and crashed into the barricade. Rocks blocked the passage, spears behind the rocks. The first horses reared up, the riders screamed, the horses neighed, arrows flew from the ledges. The first line held for 20 minutes. Then it retreated, according to plan, in an orderly fashion, without panic. The Tarkhan vanguard surged forward, into the gorge, deeper, narrower. The horses couldn't turn around. The walls closed in, 4 abreast, no more. The second line, 200 spearmen behind the second barricade. Khan Soru stood in the center, sword in hand, voice like a bell. She shouted commands. Spears forward! Hold your ground! Do not retreat! Archers on the ledges fired downwards. Arrows rained down. The narrow gorge had turned into a trap. The Tarkhans couldn't get around it. They couldn't turn around. They couldn't use their numerical superiority. 70,000 behind them, yet the gorge could only hold 400. and those 400 were pinned against a wall of spears and died. The first day of battle lasted until dark. The Tarkans retreated. They abandoned the gorge. They set up camp at the entrance. Juhan counted the casualties. His own men, 12 killed, 31 wounded. So Mire worked all night. She bandaged, washed, and stitched. Her hands were covered in blood up to her elbows. Her face was pale, but her hands didn't tremble, not once. The Tarkan casualties. By his estimate, about 300, maybe more. The gorge was littered with bodies and horse carcasses. A good start, but only the beginning. Day 2. The Tarkans changed their tactics. They sent in the infantry, without horses, with shields, slowly, relentlessly. They pressed forward with sheer numbers. The second line held. Khan Soru stood like a rock. She didn't retreat. She wouldn't let anyone retreat. When one soldier took a step back, she stood in front of him, looked him in the eyes. He returned to the ranks. By evening of the second day, the second line barricade had been destroyed. Khan Soru led her people to the third line, in an orderly fashion, without casualties, just as he had taught. The third day, the hardest.
The Tarkans pressed forward with their full force. The gorge thundered with screams and the clang of metal. The third line held. Jahani stood at the front, 2 swords, a blur from her speed. She killed calmly and methodically, as naturally as she breathed. Rocks came crashing down, the very ones that Juhan had prepared a year ago. Wedges in the cracks, water in winter. The ice had pushed the rock apart. Now a single blow from the hammer sent tons of granite crashing down onto the Tarkan column in the middle of the gorge. A roar, dust, screams. The gorge was blocked by the debris. The Tarkans found themselves cutting too. Those inside the gorge were cut off from the main forces. Han Soru launched a counterattack. 200 spearmen charged forward, through the gorge, over bodies and rocks, forward. The cut-off Tarkans fled. Nowhere to go. Walls, rocks, spears, the rubble behind them. They threw down their weapons and raised their hands. By the evening of the third day, the gorge had been cleared. Behind the rubble stood the Tarkan army, 70,000 strong. But they could not get through. The rubble completely blocked the gorge. A detour through the mountains would take a week, and they didn't have a week, because there were 500 men in the gorge who, in 3 days, had killed 2,000 and hadn't budged an inch. On the third evening, Jahani climbed up onto a ledge. She looked beyond the barricade. She saw a figure on horseback, far away, near the Tarkan camp. The Khan of Tarkan. She drew her bow. Juhan had given her the best bow in the garrison, made of mountain ash, with a bowstring of ox sinew. She took aim. Far away. Very far away. At the limit of her range. She exhaled. Her fingers released the string. The arrow flew. After 3 heartbeats, the figure on horseback swayed and fell. Silence. Then a cry. A Tarkan cry. The cry of an army that had lost its Khan. Night. The Tarkan army did not sleep. On the morning of the 4th day, Juhan climbed a cliff above the gorge. He watched. The Tarkans were retreating. Slowly. Wearily. Without a Khan. Without a goal. 70,000 turned and marched off into the steppe. He stood on the cliff. The wind ruffled his hair. Behind him stood his men. Khan Soru with a blood-stained sword, Jahani with a bow, Somir with her hands in bandages, and Yun Hae-in, folding a map on which every movement of the battle had been marked.
Park Dong-soo stood nearby, silent.
Down in the gorge, 500 soldiers stood amid the rocks and bodies, tired, wounded, alive. They looked up at the young man on the cliff, and one by one they began to shout. Not a name, not a title, just one word. Marshal. At first quietly, then louder. Marshal. 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 They didn't know why they were shouting that word. They didn't know to whom it belonged. They simply felt that standing before them was a man who deserved it. The old veteran, the very one who had shared his soup on that winter night, stood in the front row. He knew. He alone knew. He dropped to one knee. Behind him a second, a third, 5,000, no, 500. But in the gorge beneath the black evening sky, 500 people on their knees seemed like the whole world. Ju Han stood on the cliff and looked down. His face was splattered with someone else's blood. His eyes were dry. His hands did not tremble. Marshal Lee Moo-hyun. Once he had been betrayed and executed. Once the crowd had spat on his corpse. Now 500 people stood before him on their knees, and not a single one would rise until he said so. He spoke. Rise. They rose. He descended to them. He walked along the ranks, through the gorge, amid the rocks and bodies, amid his own living and the dead of others. He looked each one in the face. He knew every name. He touched each one with his hand, a shoulder, a hand, a palm, in silence. This is how a commander walks after a battle. Not with a speech, with a silence that speaks louder than words. After Sobek, the world changed. Not immediately, not with a crash. Quietly, like a river that has found a new course. The Tarkhan army retreated into the steppe, without a Khan, without a goal. The confederation began to crack. The clans that had united under a single Khan began to argue over who would be next. The arguments turned into skirmishes. The skirmishes turned into a small war. The western border was given a respite. Not a permanent one, but long enough. A year, maybe two. Enough time to build what was needed. News of the Battle of Sobek reached the capital 2 weeks later. Manhwa Song wrote it herself. Every word was carefully chosen. Every detail was in place. 500 men had stopped 70,000. Khan Tarkana was killed. The western border had been held. The garrison's losses were 92 killed and 140 wounded. The capital fell silent. The report landed on the emperor's desk. The old emperor read it 3 times. Then he dropped his teacup. The hot tea spilled onto his silk robe. A eunuch rushed to wipe it up.
The emperor didn't notice. He stared at the report and asked very quietly, "What did you say this inspector's name is?" The eunuch replied, "Ju Han, Your Majesty, your son." The emperor was silent for a long time. Then he ordered Ju Han's personal file to be brought. Ju Han's personal file. The file was slim, just a few pages. An illegitimate son of a laundress. Exiled to a monastery at the age of 6. 11 years in exile. Transferred to the western border at his own request. Position, food inspector. A delicate matter for a man who had just saved the empire. Empress Myeong found out that very same day. Her face turned pale. Crown Prince Ju Yeol didn't understand. His mother explained, "The bastard has become a hero. Heroes cannot be killed quietly. Heroes must either be brought close and kept under control or destroyed publicly and with a charge. But a charge requires a reason,
And there are no reasons. He had won the battle that Hwang Yi-ryon's Western army was supposed to win, and Hwang Yi-ryon was only a 3-day march away but did not come. That was the worst part, not for Ju-han, but for Hwang Yi-ryon. The commander of the Western army, who was only a 3-day march away, had failed to come to the aid of the border guard post. While 500 men fought and died in the gorge, his army stood by and waited. What was it waiting for? An order. He was waiting for an order from the capital. Technically, he was right. Without an order from the emperor, a commander has no right to engage in battle. Technically. But technicalities won't save him from disgrace. The capital was abuzz. Ju-han's name was whispered, then aloud, then loudly. The bastard who saved the West. The boy inspector who stopped the horde. The prince who was forgotten but who did not forget his duty. A beautiful story. The capital loved beautiful stories. Myung Hwa-song made sure the story reached the right ears in the right form. Ju-han stood in Hamju and saw none of this. He was burying the dead. 92 people, each by name, a bow to each one. He remembered each one, who came from where, who had a family, who laughed in the ranks, who was afraid but stood his ground, who ran away but came back. He stood before the graves and said nothing. Han Soru stood beside him. The wind carried the scent of autumn, dry grass, smoke from campfires, earth. She reached out her hand and touched his palm.
He didn't pull away. They stood there, hand in hand, among the graves, in silence. Together with Mire, she tended to the wounded, day and night, a day without sleep, then another day. On the 3rd day, Ju-han came to see her in the infirmary. She was sitting on the floor against the wall. Her eyes were closed. Her hands were covered in dried blood. She was sleeping while sitting. He took off his cloak and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't wake up. He sat down beside her. He sat there for an hour. He watched over her as she slept. When she woke up, he told her that not a single wounded soldier had died after the battle. Everyone she had treated had survived. She looked at him, then at her hands, then back at him, and she began to cry. For the first time in 5 years. Not out of grief, but because her father's hands, the hands they had called those of a murderer, had healed 140 people. Yun Hae-in finished the map of the Battle of Sobek. Detailed, precise. Every maneuver, every movement, every clash. She laid out the map in front of Ju-han. He looked at it. He was silent. Then he told her that this map would be included in textbooks. In 100 years, people would study it. She blushed. She lowered her eyes. Then she raised them. She looked straight at him, for the first time ever, without fear, without embarrassment, as an equal. He nodded at her. She nodded back. Jehani was sitting on the fortress wall, cleaning her swords. Ju-han approached. He sat down beside her. They were silent. Then he said that the arrow shot was impossible. The distance, the wind, the lighting, 1 chance in 1,000. She shrugged. She said she hadn't thought about the odds. She'd just shot. He looked at her. She was gazing at the horizon. The amulet around her neck glinted in the sunset. Alto silver, her mother's talisman. He told her her mother would be proud. Jehani didn't answer, but her hand brushed the amulet, quickly, gently, like a farewell and a promise all at once. Pak In-ju counted the spoils of war.
weapons from Tarkan, horses captured after the battle, provisions from the enemy's supply train. She counted for 3 days. Then she came to Juhan with her report, accurate down to the last arrow. He looked at the numbers, looked at her, said that without her the garrison would have been starving even in winter, that her work had saved more lives than swords and spears. She blushed. She lowered her eyes.
Then she said quietly that she was happy here, for the first time in her life.
Myeonghwa Song had sent a letter from the capital. She had left immediately after the battle. She had returned to the capital. She is needed there. The letter was brief. The emperor is summoning Juhan. He is not demanding it. He is summoning him. The difference is subtle but significant. A demand can be postponed. A summons cannot. The crown prince is furious. The empress remains silent. Hwang Il-ryong submitted a letter of resignation which the emperor rejected. The capital awaits a hero. Juhan read the letter. He folded it, put it away. He looked out the window. The west, hills, wind, the steppe beyond the horizon. He had spent 1.5 years here. He arrived as a boy with 2 trunks full of books. He was as a man backed by an army, a small one, but a real one. He stepped out into the courtyard. Morning. The soldiers were lining up for their morning run. A habit. Every day, without exception. He stood before the formation. He looked at their faces. 1,000 men. Every face familiar. Every name in his mind. He told them he was leaving. For the capital. At the emperor's summons. That he would return. That Khan Soru would remain in command. Silence. Then that same old veteran stepped out of formation. He knelt down. He said one word. Marshal. The formation repeated it. Marshal. 1,000 voices. Juhan stood there, silent. Then he raised his hand. Silence. He said quietly, I'm not a marshal. I'm a food inspector. He paused. Then he added, for now. The ranks burst into laughter for the first time in a long while. Laughter that was free, lively, not military, human. That evening he packed his things. Not much. The same 2 trunks. Only now they contained more than just books. Maps, reports, lists, plans. Everything he had built on paper over the past 1.5 years. Han Soru came to him. She stood in the doorway. She was silent. He looked up. He looked at her. She stood in the doorway, light from the hallway behind her, her face in shadow. Tall, strong, with weather-beaten hands and a braid down to her waist. The woman who had single-handedly dragged a crumbling garrison along for 3 years. The woman who had stood with a sword in front line in the Sobek Gorge. The woman who had never once asked him who he really was. She entered. She approached. She stood before him. She placed her hand on his shoulder. He froze. She said quietly, "Whoever you may be."
You're here. That's enough.
He looked up at her. She was taller than him. He was still in the body of a 17-year-old who hadn't yet grown to his full height. But she was tall and strong, standing before him, her hand on his shoulder, warm and heavy. He felt something crack inside. Something he'd kept locked away for 2 lifetimes. A wall. Between Marshal Lee Mu-hyun and the young man Juhan. Between the past and the present. Between the man who died once and the man who lives again. The wall cracked. He closed his eyes. One tear. Just one. For 2 lifetimes. It rolled down his cheek and fell onto her hand. She didn't pull her hand away. She stood there, holding him. He breathed, steadily, slowly. He opened his eyes, dry. He nodded. She nodded back. She pulled her hand away. She left. In the morning, he mounted his horse. Park Dong-soo was by his side, as always, a shadow and a pillar of support. His people stood at the gate: Han So-ro, Je-han-ni, So-mi-re, Yun-hae-in, and Park Un-ju. Soldiers stood behind them. He looked at each of them. He memorized them all. He urged his horse forward. He rode off, eastward, toward the capital, toward the emperor, toward the throne he would take if he had to. Halfway there, he stopped on a hill. He turned around. Hamju stood on its hill. Stone walls, towers, a banner fluttering in the wind. A fortress that had been dead and had come back to life, just like himself. He looked at it and thought of the woman who had brought his mother the copper amulet, an old vassal of the Seoul family. He had arrived a week before his departure, an old man on an old horse, with a copper amulet wrapped in a rag. His mother's amulet, So Yuna's, the youngest daughter of the Seoul clan, which had been destroyed for having seen the threat from Tarhan before anyone else. The old man told the truth. So Yuna was not a laundress. She was the youngest daughter of a great house. She was poisoned a year after Juhan's birth, but before her death she performed a ritual, an ancient ritual of the Seoul family, the return of the faithful one, a ritual that summons the soul of a slandered warrior into the body of a blood relative. She gave her life so that her son might have a protector. The ritual took effect 17 years later, when the body had matured. Juhan sat before the old man, holding the copper amulet. Small, warm, worn. His mother. A woman he had never known. A woman who died for him before he even realized he was alive.
A woman who pulled Marshal Lee Moo-hyun back from death and placed him into her son's body. Not the gods, not fate, his mother. He sat there, holding the amulet, and wept for the first time in 2 lifetimes. Not just one tear, many. Quietly, silently, like a child who had finally found a home and realized that home had always been with him. Park Dong-soo stood by the door and wept as well, silently, like a soldier. Now he was riding toward the capital, his mother's amulet around his neck, close to his skin, warm. The army behind him. Ahead, an empire that must be dismantled and rebuilt. He was in no hurry. The road was long, 2 months on horseback. He would ride through the same villages and towns. He would see the same stooped peasants, the same tattered boots on the soldiers, the same rotting bridges, the same empire that executes its defenders and rewards its executioners. But now he was riding not as a forgotten bastard, as a war hero, as a man backed by 1,000 soldiers and 6 women who would change the world, as a man who knows that an empire is not a throne. An empire is people, a stable hand with a sore knee, an apothecary with green fingers, a cartographer with ink stains on his face, a mercenary with her mother's amulet, a peasant woman who thinks faster than she speaks, an aristocrat smarter than her brothers,
a 19-year-old girl who single-handedly held the garrison together for 3 years and once placed her hand on the shoulder of a boy with the eyes of an old man and said, "Whoever you are, you belong here." He was riding east. The sun was rising ahead. Behind him lay the steppe, the wind, and the fortress on the hill. Ahead lay the capital, the throne, and a war that was not yet over. But he was not afraid. He had already died once. The second time would be harder, because now he had someone to live for.